There is a word in ancient Hebrew that changes everything. It appears in the second chapter of Genesis, hidden right in the middle of a verse you've probably heard 1,000 times in your life. In sermons, in Sunday schools, in biblical movies, in Sunday dinner conversations. The word is Adamah. And Bible translators for over 2,000 years have said that it means mud. They said that God took Adamah and shaped the first man. And that's why he was called Adam, the mud man. But that is a lie. Adamah in the original Hebrew, that Hebrew spoken by the ancient prophets, before late scribes rewrote everything to serve the temple priests, Adamah does not mean mud. It does not mean inert clay. It does not mean sludge forgotten on the ground. Adamah means fertile earth. It means matter that generates life. It means soil from which all living things sprout spontaneously, and the name Adam therefore never meant made of mud. It meant something else. It meant something that for centuries someone made a point of hiding from you. Adam means the one who emerged, the one who sprouted, the one who grew, the one who came from within the natural process of life, just as trees, animals, flowers, and bacteria sprout. He was not shaped by divine hands. He was not sculpted like a statuette. He was not breathed into by an old man with a white beard living somewhere in the sky. Adam emerged, and that word, emerge, is embedded in the very Hebrew letters that open the Bible. The word is there. It has always been there. You just were never invited to look closely. Now stop. Think for a moment about the weight of this. For over 1,500 years, the entire Western humanity has been taught to see itself as a finished product, a creature shaped from the outside, a kind of clay doll that received borrowed life from a distant god and has to repay that life with interest, in obedience, in guilt, in fear, in shame of its own body, in distrust of its own mind. Billions of people have lived and died believing in this image of themselves. Billions grew up with the idea that they are small, that they are sinners, that they were born wrong, that they need to be saved by someone from the outside, some priest, some prophet, some institution, some ritual. And all of this somehow rests on the translation of a single word, a word that has been translated incorrectly, or, and this is the more unsettling possibility, translated on purpose. It was exactly this discovery that in the 17th century led a man to be excommunicated, persecuted, stabbed in a dark street, watched by international spies, banned from practically every country in Europe, and finally to die at 44 in a small room in The Hague, with tuberculosis in his lungs and a silent smile on his lips, whispering in Latin his last 3 words, Vivi. Pensei. È sufficiente. His name was Baruch Spinoza. And what he discovered, reading the Bible in ancient Hebrew with the patience of a scientist and the courage of a madman, was so devastating that 3 centuries later, when Albert Einstein was asked if he believed in God, he replied with a single phrase that still appears on the walls of universities and in the notebooks of philosophers around the world. I believe in the God of Spinoza. Who was this man? What did he see that no one before him had the courage to see? What was written in the manuscripts he hid under the floor of his room, wrapped in thick cloth, away from the eyes of the rabbis who had cursed him and the Christian pastors who demanded his head? What did he find, comparing sacred texts in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin, that led him to conclude that the entire story humanity told about itself was merely a simplified allegory, a childish version of a much greater, much older, and much more disturbing truth? And above all, why was this truth he discovered so violently silenced for so long by so many different authorities, in so many countries, in so many languages? The answer will challenge everything you have been taught. Spinoza discovered that the story told in Genesis is not a lie, but it is also not literal. It is a mirror where the ancients looked, millennia ago, and tried to draw, with the symbols available in their time, something they themselves barely understood. And when this mirror is broken by careful reading, by comparing ancient texts, by the archaeological discovery of 5,000-year-old Sumerian tablets, that tell the same story with different names, another truth emerges behind it. A truth that makes one tremble, the truth that man was never molded, the truth that man never fell from anywhere, the truth that man is, and always has been, part of something immense, something that was there before the first human breath, before the first word, before the first articulated thought, something that continues to be here, now, inside you, at this very moment, reading these lines with eyes that do not know they are looking into an abyss. Spinoza called this the one substance. The ancient Sumerians called it Apsu, the primordial ocean. Hindus call it Brahman. Christian mystics called it Una. Einstein called it the ordered harmony of all that exists. And 21st century physicists, without even mentioning Spinoza, today call it the unified field, this invisible fabric that connects every atom in the universe to every other atom, from the beginning of time until now. Each culture found a different name, but all, at their core, are talking about the same thing, and all are saying that you are not what you think you are. You are not a clay doll, you are not an exiled soul. You are not a cosmic flaw wandering around with a spiritual debt on your back. You are one of the infinite forms through which the universe becomes aware of itself. Every time you breathe, it is the entire cosmos breathing through you. Every time you think, it is the infinite substance thinking itself in one of its finite modes. Every time you look at someone with love, it is the universe looking at itself for the simple pleasure of existing. This thought alone caused 3 religious communities to unite in 1656 to destroy a 23-year-old Jewish boy in Amsterdam. This thought caused the Vatican to ban his books for over 200 years. This thought made Christian mothers scare their curious children with his name. Don't think too much, or you'll end up like Spinoza, burned forever in hell. Why so much fear of a single idea? Why so much effort to silence a poor lens polisher who lived in a rented room, eating hard bread and drinking water with a few drops of wine? Because a man who understands his true origin is a free man, and free men do not easily obey kings. They do not easily fear priests. They do not easily buy what merchants try to sell them as salvation. For the system to work, it is necessary for the human being to believe that it is small, that it is guilty, that it is a clay doll at the mercy of the potter. The story of mud was useful. The story of cosmic emergence is not, and that is why, for centuries, the former was preached from every pulpit in the world, while the latter was buried in archives, burned in public bonfires, and whispered only in clandestine meetings, by candlelight, among men who paid with their lives for the right to think. Today I will tell you this hidden story. I will tell you how it really happened, with the rainy night in Amsterdam when it all began, with the 5,000-year-old tablet that came into Spinoza's hands from the Iraqi desert, with the assassination attempt on a dark corner, with the manuscripts hidden under the floor, with the silent death in The Hague, and with the chest forgotten for 300 years in a Dutch archive, which was reopened in 1976 and revealed what no one imagined existed. But more than that, I will tell you why this story matters to you. Why it changed Einstein's life. Why it still changes the lives of those who discover it, and why even now, 3.5 centuries after the death of that silent lens polisher, the truth he unearthed remains one of the most dangerous that has ever crossed human history. Settle into your chair, turn off notifications, take a deep breath. From this next moment, you will walk side by side with Baruch Spinoza through the cold streets of Amsterdam in the winter of 1656. You will feel the weight of the curse that fell upon his shoulders. You will read with him the texts he hid from the world, and you will discover, along with him, the answer to the oldest question that exists, the question every child asks and no official answer has ever been able to satisfy. Where do we really come from? The sacred story may have concealed your true origin. But today, finally, after centuries of silence, the bell will toll, and the truth, patient as always, will return home. The rain fell on Amsterdam as if the sky had a bill to settle. It was the night of July 27th, 1656, a Saturday. The oil lamps flickered behind the fogged glass of the narrow houses lining the canals. The wind cut through the alleys with a sharp, almost human sound, and the slippery stones of the Jewish quarter reflected in fragments the yellowish light escaping from the poorly closed windows. Through the empty streets, a man walked alone. He was just over 23 years old. Black hair stuck to his forehead, his eyes calm, too calm for what had just happened to him. His name was Baruch Spinoza. And that very morning, inside the great Portuguese synagogue just a few blocks away, Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera had ascended to the pulpit, holding a rolled-up parchment, and had read aloud, before hundreds of faithful in absolute silence, the most brutal curse ever recorded in the history of Dutch Judaism. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises. Cursed be he when he enters, and cursed be he when he leaves. May the Lord not forgive him. May no one speak to him. May no one write to him. May no one do him any favor. May no one remain under the same roof as him. May no one read anything he has written. The reading lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, the silence in the synagogue was so heavy that one could hear the sound of the burning candles. Women wept softly behind the wooden grates of the upper floor. Men exchanged glances with mixed expressions of fear, relief, and sadness. Children, who did not understand what had just been said, sensed, however, through the dense air of the room, that something grave had just happened, something definitive, something that had no return. Baruch was not there. He had not been summoned. He had not been given the right to defend himself. He learned of his excommunication from a friend who came knocking at his door in the late afternoon, tears in his eyes, repeating a single phrase, "Baruch, it's over. You are no longer one of us." And now that night, he walked alone through the wet streets of Amsterdam, with the rain running down his black coat, towards the small house of a Dutch friend who had offered shelter. The family had been forbidden to receive him. Former study colleagues had crossed the street when they saw him pass. Merchants closed the doors of their warehouses upon noticing his approach. At 23, he had become overnight an absolute pariah in the only community he knew. And yet, there was no sadness on his face. There was something much stranger, something that frightened the few people who crossed paths with him that night. There was a kind of serenity that no one would expect to find in someone who had just lost everything. His eyes shone with a silent, determined, almost illuminated light, as if, amid the rain and the dark, he were seeing something that no one else could see. And he was. To understand what led 3 respected rabbis to unite against a single boy, we must go back a few years, back to Baruch Spinoza's childhood, back to the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, with its synagogues, its Talmudic schools, its clandestine printing presses, and the whispered stories that circulated among the Marrano Jews, descendants of those who had been forced to convert to Catholicism during the Inquisition in Portugal and Spain, and who now, having fled to Holland, were trying, with care and fear, to be Jews in peace again. Baruch was born into this world on November 24, 1632, son of Michael de Spinoza, a Portuguese merchant of Sephardic origin, and of Hannah Deborah, a woman of fragile health who died when little Baruch was only 6 years old. His mother's death left a silent but deep mark on him, an early sense that human life is more fragile than any doctrine admits, and that all religious certainties, in the end, must be measured against the silence of a body that no longer responds to prayers. From childhood, Baruch was different. At 7, he recited the Torah with a crystalline voice that made the elders of the synagogue shake their heads in astonishment. "This boy," they said, "will be one of the great rabbis of Europe." At 10, he was already studying the Talmud. At 12, he read Maimonides' commentaries as if they were personal letters. At 15, he had delved into Kabbalah, staying up late with a heavy candelabrum on the table, deciphering the mysteries of the Hebrew letters that, according to mystical tradition, hid within them the secret name of God. At 17, he spoke 5 languages fluently: Hebrew, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and Latin. But there was something in him that the teachers could not explain. A shadow, a spark, a glimmer of independent thought that no religious school in the world likes to see grow in its students. When the other boys recited in unison the verse, "God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days," Baruch silently moved his lips and wondered, but how? In what sense? And what was there before those 6 days? When the teacher read the passage from Genesis, where God molds Adam from the mud and breathes life into his nostrils, Baruch closed his eyes and tried to imagine the scene with all his strength. He tried to see the divine hands squeezing the clay. He tried to see the breath entering the nostrils of the human doll. He tried to feel the presence of that personal, anthropomorphic, active God described by the ancient texts, but instead he felt only silence, a cosmic silence, a silence full of something, but empty of the old man with the white beard. A silence that did not deny the existence of God. On the contrary, it seemed to confirm an infinite presence, but completely rejected the image that the ancient texts painted of that presence. And this silence began to disturb him. It was at 17 that everything changed. At that age, Baruch met Franciscus van den Enden, a former Dutch Jesuit, freethinker, trained physician, who lived teaching Latin and classical philosophy to disenchanted young Jews and Christians in his own home. Van den Enden was a tall, thin man with penetrating blue eyes and a deep laugh that made the walls of his library tremble. He had abandoned the Catholic Church years before, after a spiritual crisis caused precisely by the discovery of how many pious lies his former religious order had spread throughout the world. And in the back room of his house, Van den Enden kept a forbidden library. These were books that no one in Amsterdam openly admitted to possessing, books that had been burned in public bonfires in other European cities, books by Descartes, still fresh, still controversial, clandestine manuscripts by Italian philosophers tortured by the Inquisition, treatises by Hobbes, smuggled from England. And at the back of the darkest shelf, the books of a man named Giordano Bruno, the Dominican monk who had been burned alive in the Campo de' Fiori Square in Rome on February 17, 1600, for daring to say that the universe was infinite, that there were other worlds, and that God was not a being separate from nature, but nature itself. It was there in that library that it all began. Baruch entered the room on a cold October afternoon. Van den Enden watched him in silence as the boy slid his fingers along the spines of the books. When Baruch stopped in front of Bruno's works, the old Dutchman gave a nearly imperceptible smile. "Do you want to read this?" he asked. "Can I?" "You can, but know that after reading it, you will no longer be the same." Baruch took 3 volumes home that night, hidden under his coat. He read until dawn. He read until the candle went out. He read until his hands hurt, until his eyes burned, until the fine rain of the early hours of the morning tapped on the window of his room. And when he finally closed the last book, he felt something strange in his chest, a mix of fear and liberation, as if he had, for the first time in his life, found words for something he had felt since childhood but had never been able to name. Bruno had written, in incandescent Latin, "Nature is God in things. God is not separate from the universe as the potter is separate from the vase. God is the universe manifesting itself. And man, part of the universe, is part of God. He was not molded from the outside, but is one of the infinite forms through which divinity expresses itself in itself." Bruno had paid for that phrase with his life, and Baruch, on that rainy morning in Amsterdam, knew that phrase was also his. He knew he had found in the thought of an Italian burned alive 50 years earlier the exact expression of what had been troubling his soul since childhood. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that the personal and anthropomorphic God that the rabbis described was not the real God. It was merely an image that the ancients had constructed to speak of something much greater, something that has no face, no name, no beard, no hands. Something that is all that exists, and that manifests in every falling leaf, in every shining star, in every thought that crosses the human mind. When he returned home that morning, Baruch was no longer the same boy. He was no longer the future rabbi everyone expected. He was now a man with a dangerous seed planted in his chest, and dangerous seeds, like others, always grow. The following years were years of external silence and internal fervor. On the outside, Baruch continued to go to the synagogue. He continued to recite the prayers. He continued to fulfill the rites, but inside something was working in secret. He began to hide small notebooks under the mattress, where he wrote down his most dangerous doubts. He began to attend, at night, clandestine meetings of heretical philosophers, free thinkers, atheist merchants, dissident Dutch doctors, and ex-priests from Portugal who had fled the Inquisition with scars of burning iron on their backs. It was at one of these meetings, on a winter night, in a modest house near the Herengracht Canal, that he heard a phrase that would change everything. An old Portuguese doctor with hands marked by the tortures of the Holy Office firmly grasped his arm and whispered in a low voice, almost inaudible, amid the crackling of the fireplace, "Boy, listen carefully. The sacred books were not written by God, they were written by men. And men, my young man, men always write what suits them. Always ask yourself when reading any ancient text, who did this story serve? Who did the mud serve? Who did paradise serve? Who did the fall serve? Find the answer to that question and you will find the truth." Baruch did not sleep that night. In that phrase, at that moment, in that cold house near the Amsterdam Canal, the seed was planted for what would later become the most persecuted and brilliant work of Western philosophy. For Baruch then began to do what no one before him had dared to do with such systematic courage. He began to read the Bible as if it were a human book, to study its internal contradictions, to compare versions in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin, to realize, page by page, that the traditional Genesis was not a text. It was a patchwork, a visible stitching of various different narratives written at different times, by different authors, with different theologies, and even with different names for the divinity. In the first chapter of Genesis, God was called Elohim, a Hebrew word that literally is plural, gods. And in that chapter, creation happened over 6 days, with man and woman being created together, in the image of the Elohim, with no mud involved. In the second chapter, however, God began to be called Yahweh Elohim, a different name with different syntax in a different writing style. And without any transition, creation happened again. But this time in another way. There were no more 6 days. Man was molded from the mud. Woman was made from a rib. There was a forbidden tree. There was a serpent. There was a fall. 2 creations. 2 authors. 2 names for God. 2 different stories glued together. Baruch realized with the coldness of a scientist and the passion of a mystic that the traditional Genesis was actually a collage made by Jewish scribes at some point between the 8th and 5th centuries before Christ, stitching together narratives of different origins, some very old, others late, others still rewritten by priests who wanted to standardize the official theology of the people of Israel. And it was when he began to realize this and to note everything in his secret notebooks that the first denunciations reached the rabbis. The first came in the form of a rumor. A resentful study colleague, upset by Baruch's superior intelligence, went to seek Rabbi Aboab and reported, in a low voice, that he had heard Michael de Spinoza's son say in a tavern that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, that those 5 books were, in fact, late compilations made by anonymous scribes centuries after the time Moses would have lived. Aboab nearly collapsed upon hearing this. For a rabbi in the 17th century saying that Moses did not write the Pentateuch was exactly like saying to a Catholic that Christ never existed. It was a direct attack on the entire foundation of faith. The second denunciation came a week later. A neighbor of Baruch had overheard, through the thin walls of the houses in the Jewish quarter, the young philosopher discussing with a Dutch friend about the nature of the soul. And the neighbor swore he had heard Baruch say in clear Latin, "The soul is not separate from the body. It is an expression of the same substance. When the body dies, what we called the soul reintegrates into the whole, from which it was never truly separate." The third denunciation was the most serious. It came from an anonymous informant, in the form of a note slipped under the synagogue door. Michael de Spinoza's son is saying that God created man in an allegorical sense, that man was not molded from mud, that he emerged from nature like all other creatures. Do something, before the Christians find out, before they destroy us all. The rabbis summoned Baruch for a meeting. It was in a small room without windows, illuminated only by a candle. 3 men behind a dark wooden table, Mortera, Aboab, and a third elder whose name history did not preserve. Before them, standing with simple clothes wet from the rain outside, was Baruch. "Son," Mortera began with a controlled voice but trembling at the edges, "tell us that all this is a lie. Tell us that these words did not come from your mouth. Tell us that you still believe in Moses, in the Torah, in the God of Abraham, and we will forget. You can return to your life. You can still be who we always wanted you to be." Baruch looked long at the candle flame, then at the trembling hands of the old rabbi, then at the low ceiling of that suffocating room. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out with that strange serenity that would frighten anyone who knew him for the rest of his life. "Master Mortera, you yourself taught me when I was 12 that a true Jew never accepts an answer just because others accept it. That faith without understanding is merely disguised fear. I did exactly what you taught me. I sought, and what I found is not what is written in the books. But it is also not a lie. It is something else, something greater, something more beautiful. If you want to hear, I can explain." Mortera hid his face in his hands. He said nothing more. The meeting ended in silence. Baruch left through the door, walking slowly, with his hands in his pockets. And that very night, 3 men began drafting the excommunication document. This is how Baruch Spinoza arrived at that Saturday, July 27, 1656, at the age of 23, walking alone through the wet streets of Amsterdam, after being cursed by the very community that had raised him. But inside him, something extraordinary was happening. He did not feel what the rabbis expected him to feel. He did not feel despair. He did not feel defeat. He did not feel the religious terror that the cherem curse should provoke, the fear of being expelled from God's protection, from the company of the righteous, from the promise of eternal salvation. Instead, he felt something that Spinoza himself would later describe with geometric precision in his masterpiece. He felt freedom, the freedom that only comes to those who have lost everything they were afraid of losing. That night, upon arriving at the small house of the Dutch friend who had offered him shelter, Baruch took off his wet coat, sat down at the table, took a clean sheet of paper, dipped the quill into the inkwell and wrote in Latin the first sentence of what would later become his masterpiece. "Per causam sui intelligoid, cuius essentia involvit existentiam." For that which is the cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence. It was the first proposition of the Ethics, the book that would change Western philosophy forever, the book that Goethe would read 3 times throughout his life, the book that Einstein would keep on his desk like a secret Bible, the book that, more than any other, would dare to answer that ancient question that opened our history back at the beginning. Where do we really come from? But on that rainy night in July 1656, sitting in a borrowed room, with the candle almost burnt out and the ink still wet on the paper, Baruch Spinoza did not yet know exactly how far that question would take him. He did not yet know that they would try to kill him in a dark street 7 years later. He did not yet know that he would receive, in his small room in Rheinsberg, a 5,000-year-old tablet from the Iraqi desert, brought by a hooded messenger in the middle of the night. He did not yet know that his name would circulate through Europe like a demon, and that European kings would tremble upon hearing his ideas, and that Christian mothers would scare their children with his name for over 100 years. He only knew that night that he had made the only possible choice. He had chosen the truth, and the truth, as he would discover in the following years, is a road that once begun has no turning back. A week after the excommunication, Baruch did something that no one expected. He refused his father's inheritance. Michael de Spinoza had died 3 years earlier, leaving his children a significant sum of money, commercial properties, and a network of contacts in Mediterranean trade. Under Dutch law at the time, Baruch, being the eldest son, was entitled to the largest share of that inheritance. And since he was now excommunicated and isolated, with no guaranteed source of income, any reasonable person would have fought for every penny that was rightfully theirs. But Baruch was not a reasonable person. He was a lucid person, which is completely different. His younger sister Rebecca, seeing the golden opportunity that had opened up with her brother's curse, had gone to a Dutch civil court and tried to annul Baruch's right to the inheritance, claiming that an excommunicated person could no longer be considered a legitimate part of the family. It was a low blow, Rebecca knew perfectly well that her brother had no emotional or financial ties to their father's money and was merely trying to take advantage of the situation. What she did not expect, however, was what happened next. Baruch hired a lawyer. He went to court. He presented his arguments with the cold precision of someone who was already beginning to secretly develop the geometric method he would later apply to philosophy. And he won the case. Every penny of the inheritance was legally his. And then, after winning, he did something that left the judge, the lawyers, and the clerks in silence. He turned to his sister, placed all the money in her hands, and said calmly, in Dutch, "It was important for me to prove that I was right, but I don't need the money. You can keep it all. I will live off my work." He left the court without looking back. He walked through the streets of Amsterdam to the house of an acquaintance, and that very afternoon he asked to learn the trade that would define the rest of his life, the trade of lens polishing. For someone who had never worked with optical glass, it is hard to understand the level of perfection required by this profession in the 17th century. Lenses were polished by hand, on metal discs covered with fine abrasive paste. The craftsman held the small piece of glass between his thumb and forefinger and pressed it against the disc in precise circular movements for hours on end, day after day, week after week. Any excessive pressure would break the lens. Any wrong angle would distort the curvature. Any impurity on the disc would scratch the surface and ruin weeks of work. And even when everything was perfect, the fine glass dust would detach into the air and slowly enter the craftsman's lungs. Each perfect lens cost weeks of patience, and it also cost some years of the life of the one who polished it. Baruch chose this profession for 3 reasons. The first was practical. Lenses were items of extremely high value at that time, indispensable for new scientific instruments. Telescopes, microscopes, glasses. The demand in Europe was exploding, and good polishers were extremely rare. With his mathematical precision, Spinoza would quickly become one of the best craftsmen in Holland, selling lenses to Christian Huygens, to the Royal Society of London, to astronomers and doctors in various countries. The second reason was philosophical. Polishing a lens is, according to Spinoza's own words in a later letter, a form of meditation. The hands work and the mind quiets. The world disappears. Only the glass, the disc, the movement, and the silence remain. It was a job that perfectly matched the kind of person he was becoming, a man who needed daily hours of silence to let his thoughts mature within him. And the third reason was symbolic. Spinoza had realized during his studies that a lens modifies what one sees through it. It does not change the thing itself. It changes the perception of the thing. If you look at the moon with the naked eye, you see a silver disk. If you look through a well-polished telescope, you see craters, mountains, valleys, complex shadows. The moon has not changed. Your ability to see it has changed. And this small difference between the naked gaze and the instrumented gaze was the key to understanding absolutely everything. For Spinoza was beginning to suspect something dangerous, that religions were lenses. Each people, each culture, each era had looked at the same fundamental reality, the reality of existence, of origin, of being, through a different lens. The Hebrews looked through the lens of a personal God. The Greeks looked through the lens of the Olympic gods. The Egyptians looked through the lens of cosmic forces. The Hindus through the lens of the impersonal Brahman. Each lens showed something true, but none showed everything. And the total truth, the complete philosophical moon, so to speak, could only be seen by those who compared all the lenses at once, discovering what is common to all of them and what is merely distortion from each. A man who polished lenses during the day and studied religions at night would be symbolically doing the same thing on 2 levels. And it was exactly this man that Baruch decided to become. He rented a small room in the house of a Dutch family that belonged to a religious group called the Collegians. The Collegians were a dissident Christian community formed in the early decades of the 17th century that had rejected all ecclesiastical hierarchies. They had no priests, they had no bishops, they had no official doctrines. They believed that each person, without distinction, could and should read the Bible on their own, interpret it by their own conscience, and seek God through silent meditation fraternal conversation, and critical study of ancient texts. To the Dutch Reformed Church, the collegians were dangerous heretics. To Baruch Spinoza, they were brothers. The family that took him in did not care at all about his excommunication. On the contrary, they saw in him exactly the kind of seeker who had been persecuted by the rabbis precisely for being too courageous for the community. Within a few weeks, Baruch was already dining with them, discussing philosophy, teaching Latin to the younger children, and listening in return to readings of dissident Christian philosophers he did not yet know. It was in that small room, with a window overlooking a yard full of yellow tulips in the summer, that Baruch began to live his new life. The routine was simple and relentless. He woke up before dawn. For an hour he read ancient texts, in Hebrew, in Greek, in Latin. He had a modest breakfast, black bread, cheese, a cup of weak tea. He polished lenses from morning until early afternoon, with such absolute concentration that the rest of the world seemed to disappear during those hours. He had an even more modest lunch, sometimes just a piece of bread and an apple. In the afternoon, he received visitors, merchants who came to buy lenses, curious neighbors, and, increasingly often, young scholars who had heard about the excommunicated philosopher and wanted to meet him in person. At night, he wrote, for 4, 5, 6 hours straight, by the light of a single candle, with the ink drying slowly in the cold winter of Holland. The neighbors called him the silent saint. Others with less generosity called him the crazy Jew who lives like a monk. But everyone, without exception, noticed that that thin man with calm eyes was different from all the other men they knew. Baruch ate so little that his landlady, worried, often left extra portions of food at his door, portions that often remained untouched until the next day. He always wore the same 2 clothes, alternating them as one was being washed. He had no furniture other than a narrow bed, a simple wooden table, a chair, and 2 shelves with books. He had no luxury, except for a single object that he kept with extreme reverence, a worn copy of Euclid's Elements, with notes in the margins in 3 different languages. This was the book he read before going to sleep, the book he would consider for the rest of his life the perfect model of all human knowledge, the book whose form, definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations would shape, years later, the entire structure of his masterpiece. For Spinoza had had a revolutionary intuition. If geometry could prove eternal truths about triangles and circles with absolute rigor, truths that Pythagoras had demonstrated 2,000 years earlier, and that remained true today at any point in the universe, why could philosophy, theology, ethics not be proven with the same rigor? Why continue to discuss God, the soul, happiness, with vague, rhetorical arguments based on emotion and authority? Spinoza decided he would do it differently. He would demonstrate with mathematical rigor the truth about the origin of man, the truth about the nature of God, the truth about human happiness. He would not ask for faith. He would not appeal to the authority of prophets, popes, or rabbis. He would build step by step, like a geometer constructs a theorem, a philosophical system so solid that any reasonably intelligent person, reading it carefully, would be compelled, by the very logical force of the propositions, to accept its conclusions. And it was thus, in that little room in Amsterdam, in the winter of 1656 and throughout the following years, that he began to write the first version of what would later be justly called Ethica, Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata, the Ethics, demonstrated in the geometric manner, the most dangerous work of the century, the most beautiful work, the work he would never see published in his lifetime, the work that would change, centuries later, the thoughts of Einstein, Goethe, Hegel, of entire generations of philosophers and scientists who had not yet been born. But before we continue, I want to pause you here, because what you just read, the serene refusal of the inheritance, the choice of a poor life, the decision to live polishing glass in silence instead of receiving easy money from a family that had rejected him, is not just a curious biographical detail, it is a mirror. Spinoza, at 23, had just discovered something that most people take a lifetime to discover, and that many never discover. He had discovered that true freedom is not having more, it is needing less. He had discovered that everything you own and that you fear losing is an invisible chain tied to your ankle. That every material good, every social approval, every external confirmation you need to feel good about yourself is a piece of your freedom that you unwittingly hand over to others. And that, to discover who you really are, to begin to discover, you must, at some point in life, cross a door. A door that only opens when you are willing to lose what you thought you needed to have. Most of us never cross that door. Spinoza crossed it at 23, and on the other side of it, he found exactly what he had come to seek: silence, lenses, books, paper, ink, and the strange contemplative joy of someone who is finally doing the work they came to do in the world. Think about that for a moment. Think about how much you still carry in your life just out of fear of letting go. Think about how much inner freedom you could gain if one day you found the courage to do what Spinoza did in that Amsterdam court. Look at everything society says is important, smile calmly and simply say, "You can keep it, I don't need it." And while you think about that, I make a simple request. If this story is touching you, if this young lens polisher in 17th century Amsterdam is making you reflect on things you haven't thought about in a long time, leave a comment below telling me, what is the invisible chain you feel you need to cut in your life? It could be a relationship that has drained you. It could be a job that suffocates you. It could be an old belief that you know, deep down, no longer fits who you have become. Write it down. Because sometimes, writing a truth is already the first step to freeing it. And subscribe to the channel. It's not for me, it's for you. Because here, in this space, we don't tell stories to pass the time. We tell stories to awaken. There will be a letter from London that changes everything. There will be a 5,000-year-old tablet arriving in the middle of the night. There will be an assassination attempt. There will be a night when all of Holland ignites in violence. There will be, in the end, the serene death of a man who discovered what very few discover. Activate the bell. Leave your like. Come with me, because those who reach this point did not arrive by chance. Let's return to Amsterdam. The year was now 1660. 4 years had passed since the excommunication. Spinoza was 27 years old. The small room in the Collegian House was starting to feel too small for his ambitions. The lenses he polished were already famous throughout Holland. Doctors from Leiden were ordering microscopes, astronomers from The Hague were requesting telescopes, and the young Christian Huygens, who was beginning to gain fame for his astronomical discoveries, was sending complimentary messages about the quality of Spinoza's work. But the city of Amsterdam also brought painful memories. Former colleagues from the synagogue would cross the street when they saw him. Merchants from the Jewish neighborhood pretended not to know him. His own family, except for a sister who, in secret, still sent him some affectionate letters, had officially cut all ties with him. Spinoza needed more silence. He needed more distance. He needed a place where he could work in peace, without the constant weight of memories. That's how in early 1661 he decided to move to Rijnsburg. Rijnsburg was a small village a few hours from Amsterdam near Leiden, the most important university city in Holland. It was surrounded by canals, windmills, and fields of tulips. It had just over 300 inhabitants, and it had above all a significant community of collegians who welcomed Spinoza with the same fraternal affection he had known in Amsterdam. He rented a room in the house of the surgeon Herman Homan, a friendly and quiet man who would become his friend. The window of the room overlooked a garden where, in spring, the tulips exploded in red, yellow, and white. At night, one could hear the distant sound of the canals, and occasionally the ringing of an old bell from the village's small church. It was the perfect place, and it was exactly there in that perfect place that something happened. Something Spinoza had never imagined would happen, and that would forever change the course of his work. On a foggy morning in October 1661, the landlady knocked on the door of his room with a curious smile on her face. She had in her hands a sealed letter from London, with a seal she had never seen before, a globe with an open book on it, and an inscription in Latin, Nullius in verba, "Don't trust the word of anyone." It was the seal of the Royal Society of London. Spinoza opened the letter with careful hands, and, upon finishing reading, he remained silent for many minutes, looking out the window at the garden without moving. for he had just received a letter that would change the history of philosophy. The letter had 14 paragraphs, and each one of them, read carefully, was a door opening to a new world. It was signed by a man named Henry Oldenburg, a German naturalized Englishman, founding secretary of the Royal Society, personal friend of Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, regular correspondent of Christian Huygens, and one of the most well-connected figures in the international network of scientists and philosophers who were beginning to reshape human understanding of the universe. Oldenburg had heard of Spinoza through Dutch travelers who had recently been in London. These travelers had described, with a mix of admiration and fear, the young excommunicated lens polisher living in Rijnsburg, who was secretly developing a philosophical system capable of shaking the foundations of Western theology. Oldenburg, fascinated, decided to write personally. The letter began with formal courtesy. It spoke of scientific issues, atomism, chemistry, optics, but by the 6th paragraph it subtly changed tone. Oldenburg began to ask questions that went far beyond science, questions about the relationship between God and nature, questions about whether physical laws could be eternal and necessary, rather than freely created by a divine will. Questions, in short, about exactly the things Spinoza had been working on for years, in silence, without ever sharing with anyone. It was as if Oldenburg, on the other side of the English Channel, in a city Spinoza had never visited, had somehow guessed the exact direction of his thought. The last sentence of the letter said, "Would you be willing to share your reflections with me? I await your response with the most sincere expectation." Spinoza placed the letter on the table. He walked to the window. He looked at the garden. The autumn leaves were slowly falling from the trees, dancing in the cold wind. Outside, all of Holland seemed to be breathing after a night of rain. And for the first time in 5 years, since the excommunication, since the refusal of the inheritance, since the decision to live in silence polishing glass, he felt something he had almost forgotten how it was. He felt he was not alone. There were, somewhere, other minds thinking similar things. There was an invisible international secret network formed by men who had, each in their own way, arrived at the same suspicions, and this network was now reaching out to him. Spinoza picked up the quill. He dipped it in the inkwell, and he began to draft a response that would change the history of philosophy. But he soon stopped. He thought. He bit his lip. He put down the quill. For he knew, with the cold clarity that always characterized him, that he was at a dangerous crossroads. If he responded with total honesty, exposing the foundations of his system, he would be handing over his most dangerous thoughts to a man he did not even know personally. And in the 17th century, in a Europe where letters were routinely intercepted by spies, where the post was controlled by churches and states, where a single misinterpreted phrase could lead a man to the stake, that was not just an intellectual choice, it was a choice of life or death. On the other hand, if he responded with excessive caution, with polite banalities, with vague formulations, he might lose perhaps the only chance of his life to finally converse with someone capable of truly understanding him. He would lose the chance to insert his ideas into the great current of European thought, at the exact moment when this current was being redrawn by men like Boyle, Huygens, Descartes, recently deceased, and the young Newton. Spinoza thought for 3 days, and on the 3rd day he decided to take the risk. The letter he wrote would become famous among historians of philosophy, not for its length, it was relatively short, but for its courage. Spinoza began with courtesy. He thanked for the approach. He briefly discussed some scientific issues, and then in the 6th paragraph he began to expose, delicately but without retreat, the foundations of what would become his philosophy. He spoke about Descartes. The great French philosopher who had died in 1650 was the most important intellectual reference of the time. Descartes had tried to prove the existence of God through reason, and had clearly separated the material world, extension, from the spiritual world, thought. For Descartes, God was a being distinct from nature, a transcendent creator, separate from the created world, just as the potter is separate from the pot. Spinoza wrote with geometric coldness, Descartes was wrong. For if God is infinite and nature exists, then two infinite substances cannot coexist. If God is everything, then nature is God manifesting. That which men call God and that which men call nature are two words for the same reality, seen under different aspects, but identical in substance. It was an apparently abstract sentence, but for any educated reader of the 17th century, it was a bomb, for it demolished in a single proposition the entire foundation of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim theology. If God and nature are the same thing, then there is no creator separate from creation. There is no personal God above the world. There is no divine judge looking down on men. There is no heaven and hell as distinct physical places. There is no possibility of miracles in the traditional sense, for nothing can violate the laws of nature, if those laws are the very laws of God. And above all, there is no creation of man, for man, being part of nature, is part of God, and exists not as a manufactured product, but as one of the infinite forms through which God expresses himself. When Oldenburg read this sentence, sitting in his office in London weeks later, he remained silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked around the room. He returned to the table. He reread the sentence and whispered in Italian, one of his several languages, "Mio Dio, questo uomo è pericoloso." My God, this man is dangerous. But it was a kind of danger that Oldenburg loved above all others, the danger of true intelligence, the danger of one who thinks for themselves. And in the following weeks, letters began to cross the English Channel in both directions with increasing frequency. It was in this correspondence, and which would last the next 16 years, until Spinoza's death, that something extraordinary began to unfold. For Oldenburg, in the 5th paragraph of his second letter, mentioned almost casually something that Spinoza could not ignore. "If you are interested," Oldenburg wrote, "I have in my private library copies of extremely rare manuscripts from the East that seem to contain narratives older than those of Genesis, about the creation of the world and man. They were brought to London by an English merchant who was in Constantinople, and who obtained them from a wise Sephardic Jew. The narratives are surprising. If you ever pass through London, or if you trust a messenger, I would be pleased to share them." Spinoza only realized the significance of this sentence when he reread the letter 3 weeks later on a cold November night. At that time, Genesis was considered by Christian and Jewish tradition the oldest text that existed about the origin of the world. It was believed that Moses had written it by divine inspiration over 3,000 years ago. To suggest that there were texts preceding Genesis with similar narratives, narratives about creation, about the first man, about the flood, was a heresy as great as denying the Trinity. But Spinoza had already heard rumors. Years earlier in Amsterdam, a Dutch merchant who had traveled to the Ottoman Empire had secretly told him about clay tablets found in Mesopotamian ruins, tablets written in a strange language, prior to Hebrew, that contained stories very similar to those in Genesis, only with different names and with crucial differences. In these tablets, man was not created by a single God in a single act. He emerged from a long, complex cosmic process involving various natural forces over countless ages. At that time, these accounts were treated as travelers' fables, but Spinoza, upon rereading Oldenburg's letter, felt his heart race. He wrote an immediate response, and, with almost obsessive caution, he asked, "Dear Oldenburg, I was deeply intrigued by your mention of Eastern manuscripts. Could you tell me more about them? What is their origin? In what language? Do they really suggest narratives preceding Genesis about the creation of man? I have a special interest in this issue, as I have been dedicating myself in recent years to a critical study of sacred texts, and I suspect that many of the traditional narratives about our origin may have roots much older than officially admitted." He sent the letter with a trusted messenger and waited. Oldenburg's response took 3 months. When it finally arrived, Spinoza noticed by the different tone of the letter that something had changed. Oldenburg was now writing with more care, with more ambiguous sentences, with veiled references, as if he knew that his correspondence was being read by third parties. "Dear friend," the new letter said, "regarding the subject you mentioned, I ask for your patience. The manuscripts I referred to are no longer in my possession. They were removed from my library by higher orders a few weeks ago, without explanation. I advise you not to mention this subject in writing anymore. Proceeding in this direction may be dangerous for both of us. When you can, travel to London. We will talk in person. There are things that should not be entrusted to paper." Spinoza turned pale. The final sentence of that letter was an explicit warning. Someone, some authority, some court, some network of informants, was monitoring his correspondence with London. And the subject of the ancient manuscripts about the origin of man was, in some way, considered so sensitive that it was being actively suppressed. By whom? Why? What European power cared so much about tablets from 5,000 years ago? Spinoza had no answer. But something inside him awakened, an intuition, a spark, a strange, almost prophetic certainty that he was on the right path, that there was indeed a buried truth about the origin of human beings, a truth that had been covered with myths, allegories, pious lies, conscious censorship over the centuries, and that it was up to him, in that quiet little room in Rheinsberg, with ink-stained hands and glass dust, to begin to unearth it. It was that night that he began a new notebook. A notebook that he would hide under the floorboards of his room. A notebook that he would never publish in his lifetime. A notebook whose fate would be to be discovered, more than 300 years later, in a forgotten chest in the archives of the Royal Library of The Hague. On the first page of that notebook, Spinoza wrote in Latin, "De origine hominis, quid celatum est," on the origin of man, what has been concealed. And then, with the pen still in hand and the candle burning slowly, he began to do what no one before him had dared to do with scientific seriousness. He began to dismantle Genesis, not to destroy it, not to offend it, but to understand it, to see, behind the shell of the narrative, what was the kernel of truth that the ancient authors had tried, with their limited resources, to convey to their contemporaries, and that centuries of literal readings had buried. He read Genesis in Hebrew in his childhood language. He compared it with the Septuagint, the Greek translation made by Jews from Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. He compared both with the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome. He compared with Aramaic fragments he had obtained through a friend from Leiden. And he realized something that no one wanted him to perceive. Genesis was not a text. It was a patchwork quilt. In the first chapter, God is called Elohim, a Hebrew word in plural form. Traditional theologians explained this as plural of majesty, similar to the we used by kings. But Spinoza, comparing it with other texts from the ancient Middle East, realized that this explanation was flimsy. Elohim, in sources predating Judaism, actually designated a council of cosmic forces, a word that later theology had tried, with some embarrassment, to fit within the subsequent monotheism. And in that first chapter, creation happened without any clay. Man and woman were created together at the same time, in the image of the Elohim, with no mention of rib, molding, or special vital breath. In the second chapter, God's name changed. Now it was Yahweh Elohim. The writing style changed, the vocabulary changed, and without any transition, without any justification, creation happened again, only in a completely different way. There were no longer 6 days. Man was molded from clay. Woman was taken from a rib. There was a forbidden tree. There was a serpent. There was a fall. 2 creations. 2 names for God. 2 styles. 2 authors. Spinoza compared everything carefully. He crossed out. He underlined. He made notes in the margins in 3 languages. And he concluded, with the coldness of a philologist and the courage of a heretic, what centuries later would be confirmed by all modern biblical criticism. The traditional Genesis was a patchwork, made by late Jewish scribes, probably between the 8th and 5th centuries BC, stitching together narratives of different origins, with different theologies, and even with different names for the divinity. One of the sources was older and more sophisticated, the source today called priestly, the one from the first chapter. The other source was more anthropomorphic and more narrative, the source today called Yahwist, the one from the second chapter, from Eden, from clay, from the serpent. And there were, behind both, echoes of something even older. Echoes of Mesopotamian traditions that had circulated through the Middle East for millennia, before the people of Israel even existed as an organized people. That was it. That was what Oldenburg was suggesting with his mention of the manuscripts from the East. The manuscripts confirmed that the story told in Genesis was not original. It was a simplified rewriting of something much older, and that something older held about the origin of man. A version that theologians did not want, under any circumstances, for humanity to rediscover. But why? Why such fear of an older narrative? What could be so dangerous in a story written by Sumerians 5,000 years ago? Spinoza did not yet know. But he was about to find out, for while he feverishly wrote in his secret notebook that cold winter of 1661 in Rheinsberg, someone, somewhere in Eastern Europe, in some distant Mediterranean port, on some ancient trade caravan route, was preparing to make a dangerous journey toward his home, with a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth, a bundle that contained inside it a piece of clay 5,000 years old. And on that piece of clay, inscribed in cuneiform writing, were some of the oldest words humanity had ever managed to preserve about itself, words that would change everything. Snow fell for 3 consecutive weeks that winter of 1662. In Rheinsberg, the canals froze, the tulips slept beneath the white earth, the windmills stopped at dusk, unable to turn against the cold wind that cut through the village. The inhabitants lit fires in their fireplaces at 4 in the afternoon, closed the shutters of their windows, and plunged into a winter silence that lasted from December until early March. Spinoza, in his small room, lived this silence as if it were an ally. He polished lenses in the morning, with thin leather gloves to protect his hands from the cold. He had a thin vegetable soup for lunch that the landlady left at his door. He read in the afternoon, taking advantage of the few hours of natural light. And at night, when the cold tightened and the candle flickered on the table, he wrote in his secret notebook about the origin of man. Sometimes, while writing, he heard footsteps outside. A shiver came to his mind, but it was just the wind, or a villager returning home. Nothing more. For now. It was on a night in mid-February that everything happened. The snow was falling heavily outside. The candle had already been replaced twice that night. Spinoza had been writing non-stop since 7 in the evening, and it was now almost 2 in the morning. The fire in the fireplace had dwindled to embers. The cold in the room was biting. The philosopher's hands, even wrapped in thin mittens, ached from holding the pen. That was when there was a knock at the door. 3 knocks, slow, spaced. They were not urgent knocks. They were not violent knocks. They were calculated knocks, like those of someone who knew exactly what time they were arriving and wanted to let the occupant of the house understand that they were not coming as an enemy. Spinoza stood still. No one knocked at his door at 2 in the morning in Rheinsberg. No one. The collegians of the village were educated people who deeply respected the silence of their neighbors. The merchants who ordered lenses from him only appeared during the day. His landlady, Mrs. Homan, would never disturb him at that hour. The knocks repeated. 3 knocks, slow, spaced. He got up slowly. He took a heavy bronze candlestick, the only object in the house that could serve as a weapon if necessary. He approached the door cautiously and asked in Dutch, "Wie is daar? Who is there?" There was a pause on the other side. Then a voice responded, in Latin. Impeccable Latin with an accent that Spinoza could not immediately identify. Perhaps Italian, perhaps Sephardic, perhaps something intermediate, worn by many years of travel. Amicus sum, veni de longe, habeo quod tibi ostendere debiam. I am a friend. I came from afar. I have something I must show you. Spinoza hesitated. He looked through the window crack. Under the weak light of the moon, filtered by the snow, he saw a hooded figure tall standing in front of the door. The man was not armed as far as he could see. He carried only a leather backpack slung over his left shoulder. He stood calmly, a disquieting calm, in fact, considering it was 2 in the morning in a biting winter. Spinoza thought quickly, if that man were an assassin sent by the rabbis of Amsterdam, or an infiltrated Inquisition agent, or a spy from some European court, knocking politely would be the least likely strategy. Killers did not ask for permission. Spies did not arrive at night announcing a visit. That man, whoever he was, wanted to talk. He unlocked the door, opened it a crack, studied the foreigner's face for a few seconds. He was a middle-aged man, grey-haired, with a well-groomed beard and a thin scar running from his temple to his chin. His eyes were deep, almost black, with an ancient weariness that Spinoza recognized immediately. The weariness of someone who had traveled for decades through hostile lands in search of something he had not yet found. "Come in," said Spinoza, stepping aside. The man entered. He shook the snow off his shoes on the entrance mat. He carefully removed his hood. He looked around the small room, the simple bookshelf, the table with papers and inkwells, the narrow bed against the wall, the book of Euclid open on the pillow. He smiled slightly, as if recognizing a place he had never been but had already imagined. "Mr. Spinoza, I presume," he said in Latin. "Who are you?" The foreigner hesitated. He looked at the door. He looked at the window. He crossed the room to the table and sat down without asking for permission. Then he replied in a low voice, "My true name does not matter. You can call me Joseph if you prefer a name. I was in another life a Jesuit priest. I was in the missions of Ethiopia, Persia, India, Egypt. I saw things you cannot imagine. I learned languages that few Europeans know, and I discovered, over 30 years of travels in the East, that the story we were taught about the origin of man is just one of the versions, and perhaps the most incomplete of all." Spinoza closed the door. He sat down across from the foreigner with the table between them. He studied the tired face of the man and asked, with the calm that always characterized him, "Why did you come here?" "Because you are the only man in Europe capable of doing what needs to be done." "And what needs to be done?" The foreigner opened the leather backpack. He took out a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. He placed it on the table between them, with the delicacy of someone handling something absolutely sacred. Then he slowly unwrapped it, fold by fold, until the blue cloth lay completely open on the dark wood of the table. And Spinoza, in the flickering light of the candle, saw for the first time in his life something he had never imagined he would see. It was a fragment of a clay tablet, small, broken at the edges, covered with inscriptions in a script he had never encountered in any book, in any manuscript, in any drawing, a script made of small wedge-shaped marks, pressed into the wet clay with some kind of stylus before it had been baked in the fire long ago. "Cuneiform," whispered the foreigner. "It is the writing of the ancient Sumerians, the oldest people in the known world. This tablet is about 5,000 years old. It predates Abraham. It predates Moses. It predates Hebrew itself." Spinoza could not speak. His hands trembled. His eyes shone with a light he himself was not aware of emitting. "Where did it come from?" he finally asked in a dry voice. "From the ruins of a city called Nippur, in what today belongs to the Ottoman Empire near Baghdad. 5,000 years ago, it was the spiritual capital of Sumer, a civilization that already had cities, written laws, schools, temples, and a complex cosmology, when the ancestors of the Hebrews were still nomads without an alphabet. And how did you get this?" The foreigner smiled, a bitter smile. "I did not get it. I received it, through a chain of hands. Each hand that touches this tablet knows it is touching something forbidden. Each hand passes it on, with fear, but with the certainty that it cannot remain buried. You are the 7th person to touch it in the last 3 years, and probably the last. Why? Because from you, it needs to become words. It needs to become thought. It needs to become light that can be passed on. Otherwise, it will be destroyed by those who do not want this knowledge to reach the public." Spinoza looked at the tablet. The cuneiform symbols seemed to dance in the candlelight. "But I cannot read this," he said, with a tone of frustration. "I do not know this language. No one knows. It has been lost for over 2,000 years. The foreigner opened the backpack again. He took out a dark leather notebook worn from travel, with the edges of the pages yellowed by time. He placed it on the table next to the tablet. "This," he said, "is the key." Spinoza opened the notebook carefully. Inside, he saw pages and pages of notes in 4 languages: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. They were translations, comparisons, tables, lists of cuneiform symbols with hypotheses about their meanings compared to similar words in later Semitic languages, with inscriptions on ancient stones found in Egypt, in Damascus, in Jerusalem. And page after page, this unknown translator had managed to partially reconstruct the meaning of hundreds of those ancient symbols. "Who did this?" Spinoza asked, with his heart racing. "A brilliant Sephardic Jewish scholar from Aleppo," replied the foreigner. "A brilliant man who had access to manuscripts from the Middle East that no European has ever seen. He spent 30 years of his life trying to decipher this lost language, and he almost succeeded, but he was murdered in 1654 by agents of the Ottoman Sultan, who discovered that he was in contact with European thinkers. The notebook was saved by his student, who took it to Venice, then to Antwerp, then to Paris, and finally to my hands. Now it is in yours." "Why to me?" Spinoza asked, in an almost pained tone. The foreigner leaned over the table. His eyes had an almost feverish intensity. "Because you are the only living man today capable of transforming this into philosophy. Others would only try to publish it as an archaeological curiosity. Others would deny it as heresy. Others would try to use it to feed new esoteric cults. But you, Mr. Spinoza, you have the kind of mind that can take these ancient truths and integrate them into a new, rational system, a system that can finally free humanity from those invisible chains it has carried for centuries." Spinoza remained silent for long minutes. Then, slowly, he opened the notebook of the scholar from Aleppo. He chose a page at random. He brought the candle closer, and he began to read. And what he read that night, between 2 in the morning and dawn, with the foreigner sitting silently across the table, watching him without saying a word, kept him awake not for 1 night, but for 3 consecutive nights. The passage that first caught his attention was the translation of a tablet found in Nippur, dated by chronological comparison around 500 years before Christ. Therefore, a text more or less contemporary with the construction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt, a text written when the Hebrew ancestors were still nomadic tribes without cities, without temples, and without an alphabet. The text was called, in the reconstruction of the Sephardic translator, Atrahasis, a Sumerian word that means approximately the very wise, or the one who sees beyond, and it described the creation of man in terms that could not be more different from the traditional Genesis. According to the tablet, in the beginning of times, there was only a primordial reality, a kind of cosmic ocean, both material and spiritual, called Apsu. This ocean was the source of everything that would come afterward. It was not separate from nature. It was nature itself, in its undifferentiated form, before anything specific had emerged. From this ocean emerged the first cosmic forces, which the Sumerians called Anunnaki. These forces were not personal gods, in the sense that the Hebrews would later imagine Yahweh. They had no human form. They had no whimsical will. They were, in the careful description of the translator, active principles of nature, something very similar to what the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece, more than 1,000 years later, would call arche, or fundamental principles of reality. And after many eons, of immense incalculable times, these principles gave rise to living matter, and living matter over countless generations became more complex, passing through elemental forms, then through forms that the Sumerians described as creatures that breathed the warmth of the world, then through forms that lived in the waters but dreamed of the land, then through forms that walked on 4 legs but looked at the sky, and finally through forms that combined language, intelligence, and self-awareness, what the Sumerians recognized as the complete human being. The tablet said in the translation of the scholar from Aleppo, "Man was not made in 1 day. Man was made over 10,000 days of the gods. Before man, there were forms that walked on 4 legs but looked at the sky. Before these, there were forms that lived in the waters but dreamed of the land. Before these, there were forms that only breathed the warmth of the world. And before all, there was the unique substance which still sleeps at the bottom of each thing. Spinoza read this passage 3 times, 4, 5, and on the 5th reading, he felt something inside him break. But it was a good breaking, a liberating breaking, like when a hard shell cracks and finally allows a seed to germinate, like when an old door, which had been stuck for years, finally gives way, revealing an entire corridor that no one knew existed behind it. For what he was reading there, in that Sumerian text of 4,500 years, was exactly what he himself had been intuiting in his notes over the past months. The idea of a unique substance that manifests in progressively more complex forms. The idea that man is not a finished product, molded from clay by divine hands, but a result of a long natural process involving less complex previous forms. The idea that human consciousness did not come from outside, breathed by an external God, but emerged from within the very substance of reality, over millennia. The ancient Sumerians knew this, 5,000 years before the European Enlightenment, 1,500 years before the Hebrews wrote Genesis, 4,500 years before Charles Darwin, who would only be born in 1809, more than 150 years after that night in February 1662, when Baruch Spinoza was reading that text for the first time in Rheinsberg. The ancient Sumerians already knew. They had seen. They had noted. They had preserved in baked clay, waiting for someone at some moment in history to find the text and read it, with eyes capable of understanding what was written. And now, on that cold night of Dutch winter, with the snow falling silently outside, with a hooded stranger sitting silently across the table, with a candle struggling not to go out, that someone had finally appeared. That someone was him. Spinoza lifted his eyes from the notebook. He looked at the foreigner, and asked with a choked voice, "Why was this hidden? Why does humanity not know this? Why has this knowledge been buried for so many centuries?" The foreigner sighed. He took a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had a deep, ancient sadness, accumulated over decades of travels in the East. For a very simple reason, Mr. Spinoza. Because a man who understands that he is part of nature, who understands that he himself is an expression of the infinite substance, is a free man, and free men do not easily obey kings, they do not easily fear priests, they do not easily buy what merchants try to sell them. For the system to work, it is necessary for men to believe they are small, that they are sinners, that they are guilty, that they need external salvation, that they need intermediaries, that they need popes, rabbis, imams, kings, generals, bankers. The story of clay is useful for that. The story of cosmic emergence is not. Because the story of cosmic emergence ultimately says that man is divine by nature. And a man who knows he is divine by nature does not need anyone else to mediate between him and God. Spinoza remained silent. He looked long at the tablet on the table, at the open notebook, at the candle flame almost at its end, and finally asked, "And what do you want me to do?" The foreigner stood up slowly. He carefully put the hood back on. He walked to the door, and before opening it, turned one last time. "I want you to write, Mr. Spinoza. Write everything you have learned. Write everything you will still learn. Write without fear, but with cunning. Write so that the words survive, even if you do not survive. Because the day will come many years from now, perhaps 2-3 centuries, when archaeologists will unearth hundreds of tablets like this one, when lost languages will be deciphered, when scientists will study the origin of living beings with instruments we can barely imagine. And on that day, what you write today will seem not only truth, but prophecy. It will seem the work of a man who saw, centuries in advance, what humanity would finally discover on its own. But I will be persecuted, Spinoza said in a low voice. I will be killed. Probably, replied the foreigner, with an unexpected tenderness. But what you write will survive. And that is what matters. A man's life is short. True ideas are eternal. He opened the door. A gust of cold wind entered the room, almost extinguishing the candle and causing the papers on the table to flutter for a moment. The foreigner turned one last time. Take good care of the tablet, and take good care of yourself. This is the last visit you will receive from me, but it will not be the last from others. Soon other messengers will come. Be prepared." The door closed. The footsteps of the foreigner faded away through the snow, and Baruch Spinoza was left alone, in the center of his small room in Rheinsberg, with a 5,000-year-old tablet on the table, a notebook full of revelations, and a deep silence that now seemed to contain within it the ancient murmur of 1,000 generations of human beings who had at some moment suspected the truth. He did not sleep. He could not. He lit a new candle. He sat down at the table. He opened his own secret notebook, the one he hid under the floorboards. And he began to write. And what he wrote that night, between midnight and dawn, was the initial outline of what would become, years later, the first part of the Ethics, the part titled De Deo, on God, the most dangerous part, the most luminous part, the part that would provoke Albert Einstein 2.5 centuries later to say with tears in his eyes, "I believe in the God of Spinoza." The months that followed that mysterious visit were the most intense of Spinoza's life. He practically stopped going out. He polished lenses just enough to pay the rent and buy ink. He ate little, slept little, spoke little. The collegians of the village, worried, asked Mrs. Homan about the silent Jew from the second floor. She replied with a somewhat confused smile that he was fine, just working hard on a book that, according to him, would change the world. But there was something the landlady did not know. There was something no one knew except Spinoza and the hooded foreigner who had disappeared into the snow. Under the floorboards of the room, hidden between 2 loose boards that Spinoza had carefully removed and replaced, was now a small wooden chest. Inside it, wrapped in blue cloth, was the 5,000-year-old tablet. Beside it, the notebook of the scholar from Aleppo, and together, Spinoza's own secret notebook, where he was now writing feverishly every night, integrating what he had read with what he was deducing through pure reason. It was an explosive combination. A 17th-century philosopher, with all the geometric precision of his time, dialoguing, through time, with Mesopotamian scribes from the 3rd millennium BC. 2 extremes of human history, separated by almost 5,000 years, meeting over a single wooden table, in the light of a single candle, in a small room in a Dutch village that barely appeared on the maps of the time. And Spinoza, at the center of this impossible meeting, was writing. The first thing he did was reread Genesis with completely new eyes, for after reading the translation of the Sumerian tablets, he realized that Genesis was not just a patchwork of 2 sources, as he had identified before. It was much more than that. It was a late simplification of much older traditions, which had been reinterpreted, reduced, reorganized to serve a later monotheistic theology. And at the center of this simplification was a key word that was literally the heart of the reinterpretation, Adama. Let us return to this word, for it is the key to everything. In ancient Hebrew, Adama, as we saw in the introduction to this story, means fertile earth, not inert clay, not dead soil. It means the living soil, the raw material from which all plants, all animals, all forms of life spontaneously spring forth. Adama is the earth that generates, the earth that fertilizes, the earth that is always in a process of transformation, of production, of continuous emergence of new forms. And the name Adam, the name of the first man, comes from this word. Later translators and theologians, especially from the first centuries of the Christian era, did something remarkable with this wordplay. They froze it. They petrified it. They transformed the living metaphor, the one who comes from fertile earth, the one who emerges from the natural process of life, into a dead narrative, the one who was molded from clay by the hands of an external god. Spinoza, reading the original text in Hebrew with the meticulous attention of a philologist, realized the extent of this manipulation, and wrote in his notebook, "The ancient Hebrews, in their deepest wisdom, did not believe that man had been molded by divine hands like a clay vessel. They used the word Adama precisely because they understood, through direct observation of nature, that man sprouted from the earth just as all other living creatures sprout. But later, translators and theologians, wanting to keep man separate from nature to strengthen the power of religious institutions, transformed this living metaphor into a dead narrative. They transformed a symbol of unity into a story of separation. And this story of separation is the invisible foundation upon which still rests today the entire edifice of religious control over human souls. He continued reading, and the more he read Genesis with new eyes, the more he realized that each element of that ancient narrative was, in fact, a symbol of something much deeper, but which had been transformed into literalness by later theology. The serpent, for example. Christian theologians, for almost 2,000 years, taught that the serpent in the garden was the devil. But Spinoza, comparing the Hebrew text with earlier Mesopotamian myths, realized that, in the original tradition, the serpent, Nachash in Hebrew, was an ambiguous symbol linked both to danger and to wisdom. It was in fact the most cunning animal in the garden, and what it offered to Eve was not poison, it was knowledge. It was the ability to distinguish good from evil. It was, in other words, the awakening of reflective consciousness. The forbidden tree was not a literal tree. It was a symbol of the threshold between animal innocence and human self-awareness. The eating of the fruit represented the moment when the ancestors of modern man over millennia developed the faculty of looking at themselves from the outside, of thinking about themselves, of knowing that they knew. Before this awakening, they lived in unconscious harmony with nature, naked, without shame, without guilt, without distinction between what is right and what is wrong, just as non-human animals still live today. They were part of the whole without knowing they were part of the whole. After this awakening, they became conscious. They saw themselves as separate. They felt shame. They felt guilt. They began to distinguish good from evil. They began to fear death. They began to desire power. They began to build, with the bricks of reflection, all the glories and all the miseries of human civilization. And it was this consciousness, this terrible and wonderful consciousness, that cast them out of paradise. There was no physical garden. There was no material forbidden fruit. There was no angry God pushing two innocent creatures through the gate of an orchard in the Middle East. There was, indeed, something much grander and much more real. There was the slow and painful process by which the ancestors of Homo sapiens developed, over hundreds of thousands of years, the faculty of self-awareness. And this process was, simultaneously, a blessing and a curse. A blessing because it allowed the birth of art, science, philosophy, conscious love, reflective spirituality. A curse because it brought with it existential anguish, fear of death, the painful sensation of separation, organized violence, and the endless search for something to fill the void that consciousness opened within each human being. Spinoza wrote that night, "The fall of man was not a moral disgrace, it was the awakening of the mind. The ancient Sumerians knew this. The ancient Egyptians knew. The ancient Hebrews in their deepest traditions also knew. But as time passed, and as priests needed to control the faithful, they transformed this mythical memory of the awakening of consciousness into a story of sin. They told men, 'You are guilty. You have fallen. You need us, priests, to be saved.' Thus was born the religion of fear. Thus was born the Christianity of guilt. Thus was born the Judaism of taboo. Thus was born, in every corner of the world, the invisible structure by which a priestly minority has controlled for millennia the majority of human beings. But the original truth, hidden beneath these layers of manipulation, is that man did not fall from anywhere. He rose, he emerged, he became conscious. And this ascent, although painful, is what makes him who he is. But there was something even greater to discover. For Spinoza realized, while reading the Sumerian translations, that the crucial point was not just how man had emerged, it was from what he had emerged. If man was not shaped from the outside by a personal God, then where did he come from? How did he arise? What was exactly the process by which human consciousness sprouted from matter? And it was then that Spinoza, in the light of that nearly extinguished candle, wrote one of the most dangerous sentences in all of his secret notebook: "Human consciousness is not a divine breath that came from outside. It is an emerging property of the one substance. It exists potentially in all of nature and is actualized more intensely in certain configurations of matter, such as the human brain. Everything that exists thinks to some degree. The stone thinks in its mineral way. The plant thinks in its vegetal way. The animal thinks in its instinctive way. And man thinks in his rational way. But all these thoughts are modes of the same infinite substance, of what the ancients called God, and what I prefer to call nature." When he finished writing this sentence, he carefully closed the notebook and stared at the candle flame for several minutes, without moving, for he had just unknowingly formulated one of the most advanced and dangerous ideas in the entire history of philosophy. The idea that consciousness is not an exclusive privilege of human beings, conferred by a creator God only to them, but a universal property of reality, present in different degrees in everything that exists. An idea that in the following centuries would be silenced, ridiculed, forgotten, and that would only be seriously discussed again by cognitive science and 21st century philosophy of mind, nearly 350 years after that night, under names like panpsychism and neutral monism. An idea that physicists like David Bohm in the 20th century would rediscover through another path. An idea that neuroscientists like Giulio Tononi in 2010 would mathematically formulate as integrated information theory. Spinoza, on that cold night in February 1662, in a small room lost in a Dutch village, had just anticipated, alone with a pen, a notebook, and a candle, discoveries that human science would only make 3.5 centuries later. He was ahead of his time in a way that he could not yet imagine, and he was completely alone with this discovery. But he would not remain alone for long. For while Spinoza wrote in silence in Rheinsberg, across Europe, in other cities, in other languages, in other environments, other men, also persecuted, also marginalized, also driven by the same insatiable thirst for truth, were beginning to reach surprisingly similar conclusions, and an invisible, secret, dangerous network was beginning to form among these thinkers. In Paris, a priest named Richard Simon, a Jesuit by training, a talented philologist, was studying the Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible and arriving at the same conclusion as Spinoza. Genesis was a collage of various sources, written by various authors over several centuries. When Simon published these conclusions years later, he was excommunicated, persecuted, and his books were publicly burned in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. In London, the physician Thomas Brown was secretly writing essays on the similarities between the myths of various ancient religions, suggesting that they all described the same fundamental reality under different names. When his essays circulated clandestinely, he was reported to the religious authorities and had to publicly retract to escape trial. In Rome, a dissident Dominican monk, whose name history did not preserve, and whose personal files were destroyed after his death, was translating from ancient Greek a newly found manuscript in the catacombs of Alexandria. This manuscript, attributed to an Egyptian scribe of the 3rd century, described the creation of man as a gradual process, in which consciousness, referred to in the text as nous, would have slowly emerged from matter over geological eras. When the Vatican discovered this translation, the monk disappeared without a trace. The manuscript was confiscated and buried in the secret archives of the Holy See, where, according to some modern historians, it still remains today. In Constantinople, a Sephardic Jewish sage, exiled from Spain after the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, was collecting oral legends transmitted by Arab merchants who had come from the East, from ancient Babylon, from Persia, from the banks of the Tigris River. These legends, passed down from generation to generation since time immemorial, told that man had not been created by a single god in a single act, but had emerged from a primordial water over many eons, passing through intermediate forms before acquiring his current human form. This sage wrote his conclusions in a manuscript in Ladino, the language of the Sephardic Jews, which was lost for centuries and was only found, fragmented, in 1892. in a damp basement in Thessaloniki, Greece. Each of these men, isolated in their corner of Europe and the Middle East, was arriving at the same conclusion. The official story of the origin of man, told by the dominant religions of the time, was a childish simplification of a reality much more complex, much older, and much more beautiful. And all of them were silently paying the price of knowing too much. Spinoza, in Rheinsberg, did not personally know any of these men, but through the letters he was now exchanging with Henry Oldenburg in London, and through other correspondences, he began to maintain that year, with thinkers in Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, he began to realize with a mix of exhilaration and fear that he was not alone, that there was spread across 17th century Europe an invisible network of minds that were all converging through different paths to the same silent truth. This network would later be called by historians the Republic of Letters, a transnational, informal, secret community of free thinkers who corresponded in Latin, exchanged clandestine manuscripts, and kept alive, amid the terror of the Inquisitions and censorships, an intellectual flame that no authority could extinguish. And Spinoza was becoming, unknowingly and without seeking it, one of the secret pillars of this invisible republic. The first assassination attempt happened on a warm night in May 1663. Spinoza had turned 30 just a few months earlier. He was still in Rheinsberg, but was preparing to move. He felt he needed a larger city, with more access to books, contacts, and political allies. He had begun that year to write a second work parallel to the Ethics, a more combative, more direct book aimed at the general public. This book would be called years later Theological Political Treatise, and in it Spinoza intended to directly attack, with philological, historical, and philosophical arguments, the literal interpretation of the scriptures that had dominated Europe for over 1,000 years. It was a dangerous work. He knew that, but he did not yet know how much. On that May night, Spinoza had gone out to visit a doctor friend in a nearby village, Lodewijk Meyer, the surgeon who would later become one of the posthumous editors of his works. He carried with him a small bundle, 5 newly written pages of the Ethics, specifically the section on the nature of God, which he wanted to show to Meyer for technical comments. The village streets were almost empty. The oil lamps dimly lit the narrow sidewalks. The air smelled sweet with the first flowers of spring. Spinoza walked at a leisurely pace with his coat open, thinking about a mathematical proposition that had occurred to him during the afternoon. It was at a corner near a small canal, just as he was turning to enter Meyer's street, that it happened. A man emerged from the shadows. He wore a black cloak. His face was covered by a dark cloth up to his eyes, and without saying a single word, he advanced toward Spinoza with a sharp dagger in his right hand. It all happened extremely quickly. Spinoza saw the blade glinting in the weak moonlight. He saw the man's eyes behind the dark cloth, blue eyes, surprised by the calmness of his victim, and, in a reflex that he himself would not be able to explain later, he raised the papers he was carrying and held them in front of him, at chest height, as if they were an improvised shield. The dagger pierced the papers. It also pierced the dark coat. It touched his skin on the chest, but, and this would later be considered by Spinoza as one of the strange, significant coincidences of his life, the dagger did not wound him deeply. The 5 folded pages had deflected the angle of the blade's entry just enough for it to merely graze the skin, leaving a red line that would bleed for days, but would not hit any vital organ. The 2 men froze for a moment, their eyes locked on each other. The attacker clearly expected to hear a scream of panic, to see Spinoza run, or fall, or plead. But Spinoza did none of that. He did not scream. He did not back away. He did not call for help. He simply looked with that strange serenity that had already intrigued the rabbis 7 years earlier, and said in a low voice, in Latin, "Non timeo te, non timeo mortem, dic dominis tuis ut me occidant cum volent, sed scito quod omne verbum quod scripsi me supervivet, et eos quoque supervivet. I am not afraid of you. I am not afraid of death. Tell your masters that they can kill me whenever they want. But know that every word I have written will survive me, and it will survive them too." The attacker hesitated. The dagger trembled in his hand, and after a few eternal seconds, he simply stepped back. turned around, and ran, disappearing into a side alley never to be identified. Spinoza stood still in the middle of the street, blood slowly trickling down his chest, the pierced papers still in his hands, his heart beating in a strange quiet that did not match what had just happened. He looked at his own hands. He looked at the night sky, and slowly began to walk again toward Maya's house. When he arrived, he knocked on the door with the calmness of someone arriving for afternoon tea. Maya opened. He saw the tear in the coat, the blood, the pierced papers. He paled. "Bento." "What?" Spinoza placed the papers on the surgeon's table, sat down, and said with a gentle smile, "They tried to kill me, Lodovic, but they only managed to pierce my manuscript. Do you see? 5 pierced pages. I will have to rewrite. But let's first discuss what I brought. Look at this proposition here on the 4th page. I think it needs a more rigorous demonstration." Maya stared at his friend, speechless. For long seconds he could not react. Then he smiled, a smile of admiration and sadness at the same time, and said, in Dutch, "Bento, you are the strangest man I have ever met. They just tried to kill you and you want to discuss logic." Spinoza raised his eyes and replied, with that same serenity that would make any other man tremble, "Lodewijk, if I had stopped to feel fear, they would have won. But if I keep working, they lose. Every sentence I write after this night is a victory against fear. Every demonstration I complete is an insult to those who think they can silence me with violence. Let's work. Time is short, and the work is long." Meyer tended to the wound. It was superficial, the physical wound. But something inside Spinoza had changed forever that night. Not fear, no, a new lucidity. A definitive understanding that the time of relative anonymity had ended, that he was now a marked man, that every day he continued to live was a day stolen from invisible forces that had already decreed his death. That bloodstain on the manuscript remained. Spinoza never erased it. Years later, when his friends published the Ethics posthumously, some readers observed, perplexed, that there was a page in the first part of the work that had a small hole in the center, surrounded by a brown stain. The editors never explained what that was. But it was the blood of Baruch Spinoza, shed on that night in May 1663, and which remained preserved forever as a silent witness to his courage. After that night, Spinoza made 2 important decisions. The first was to move to Voorburg, a village near The Hague, the political capital of the Netherlands. There he would be closer to powerful allies such as Johann de Witt, the great pensionary of the Republic, who was secretly one of his deepest admirers. And he would also find it easier to disappear into the urban crowd, preventing anonymous attackers from knowing exactly where to find him. The second decision was more radical. He would accelerate the writing of the theological political treatise and publish it, anonymously, as soon as possible. He felt that time was tightening, that if he waited too long, he might not have the chance to circulate his ideas. In 1670, 7 years after the first assassination attempt, the theological political treatise was finally printed. The cover did not bear the author's name. Instead, it mentioned a false city, Hamburg, instead of Amsterdam, and a false publisher, Henricus Kunrad, an invented name. The true printer was a Dutch friend of Spinoza who took enormous personal risks to print the work in secret. The first 1,000 copies began to circulate through Europe within a few weeks, and the effect was devastating. Priests fought to obtain a copy in order to denounce its heresies. Philosophers fought to obtain a copy in order to absorb its ideas. Bold merchants paid exorbitant prices on the black market to obtain smuggled copies. Within a few months, the book was officially banned in almost every country in Europe. But the ban, as always happens with truly important books, only increased the desire to read it. And of course everyone knew, despite the anonymity, who the author was. Spinoza's name began to circulate through Europe like the name of a demon. It was pronounced with horror from Calvinist, Catholic, Lutheran, and Anglican pulpits. It was written in infamous pamphlets as the definitive example of the worst kind of atheism. Parents used his name to scare curious children. Don't think too much, or you'll end up like Spinoza, burned forever in hell. But secretly, in closed rooms by candlelight, young philosophers from Germany, France, England, Italy copied by hand the passages from the treatise. They distributed them among friends. They discussed them in clandestine meetings. And little by little, Spinoza's ideas began to infiltrate the brightest minds of that time, like an underground current that no human power could completely block. On August 20th, 1672, Spinoza's world collapsed. It was a hot Wednesday. The Dutch Republic was in the midst of the greatest political crisis in its entire history. In June of that year, the France of King Louis XIV, along with the England of Charles II and 2 German bishoprics, had invaded the country from all sides. The Dutch army, unprepared and fragmented, was crumbling in disorder. Cities fell one after another. Panic gripped the population, and amid the chaos, the crowd began to look for scapegoats. The culprits, according to popular opinion fueled by the most radical Calvinist pastors and agents of the rival Orangist party, were the de Witt brothers, Johann de Witt, the great pensionary, and his brother Cornelis. The crowd believed that the de Witts had betrayed the homeland, that they had left the army weak to protect the interests of merchants, that they had put the country at risk of foreign occupation, and Johann de Witt was, in secret, Spinoza's most important political protector, the man who had for years blocked within the Dutch government the attempts of radical pastors to prosecute the philosopher, the man who defended the separation of religion and state, the man who without fanfare kept a copy of the Ethics in manuscript on his desk in the Prince's house in The Hague. On that August Wednesday, an enraged crowd surrounded the prison in The Hague, where Cornelis de Witt was detained under false charges of conspiracy. When Johann arrived to visit his brother, the crowd attacked both of them, and what happened in the following hours was one of the most brutal episodes in European history. The de Witt brothers were dragged into the street. They were beaten to death by the frenzied crowd. Their bodies were hung upside down on a public post in the square in front of the prison. And then, and this is the detail that still horrifies historians today, parts of their bodies were cut off, cooked, and eaten by some of the most fanatical lynchers. When the news reached Voorburg, where Spinoza now lived, the philosopher remained silent for hours. Then, slowly, he took a piece of cloth. He wrote on it in large letters a single phrase in Latin, Ultimi Barbarorum, the last of the barbarians, and he left home intending to hang this poster in the square where the de Witts had been lynched, in The Hague, as a public protest against the brutality of the crowd. It was his landlord, Daniel Tiedemann, who stopped him. Tiedemann locked the door from the outside. He would not let Spinoza out. He said, pleaded, that if he went to The Hague at that moment, with that poster, he would be lynched too before even reaching the square. Spinoza became furious. For the first time in his life, he raised his voice inside a house. He banged on the door. He pleaded to be let out. He told Tiedemann that he had a moral duty to protest publicly. Tiedemann did not yield. He saved his life. And at night, when he finally calmed down, Spinoza cried. He cried for the first time since his father's death, 20 years earlier. He cried for his murdered friends. He cried for human barbarism. He cried for the country that had lost its most lucid leaders. And he cried above all for the fact that reason, once again in human history, had been defeated by the violent passion of the crowd. That night he sat at the table, with red eyes and trembling hands. He lit a candle. He took his secret notebook and wrote, "The man who has not yet understood that he is part of the infinite substance is capable of any cruelty, for he sees himself as separate from others, as different from others, as superior or inferior to others. And it is from this illusion of separation that all human violence arises. The man who understands that he and the other are modes of the same substance, that killing the other is killing oneself, that humiliating the other is humiliating oneself, that devouring the body of the other is devouring one's own essence. This man cannot be a barbarian. But man has not yet reached this understanding, and until he does, human history will continue to be written in blood." The French invasion was eventually repelled. The Netherlands survived. But Johann de Witt was dead, the great political ally of Spinoza, the one who silently protected his freedom of writing, had been lynched by the very crowd he had tried to serve. And Spinoza now was even more exposed than before. The radical Calvinist pastors, victorious with the fall of the De Witts, immediately turned against the intellectuals who had supported the fallen regime. And Spinoza's name was at the top of the list. The following years were years of increasing isolation. Close friends whispered for Spinoza to leave the Netherlands, to go to Germany, to England, anywhere safer. During that period, he received offers for university chairs in other countries. The most prestigious came from Heidelberg, Germany. The rector of the university, on behalf of the Prince-Elector of the Palatinate, offered Spinoza a chair as a professor of philosophy. Generous salary, house provided. Broad freedom to teach, with only one condition, that he would not publicly attack the established religion. Spinoza thought for 3 days. Then he refused with a letter that entered history. On a single page of impeccable Latin he wrote, "I deeply thank your Highness for the honor, but I must decline, for the imposed condition that I do not use my freedom to discuss religion is a condition that, if I accepted, would nullify the very reason for which I would be useful to a university." A philosopher who cannot say what he thinks is no longer a philosopher. He is merely a repeater of others' opinions, and I prefer to continue polishing lenses in my room, in my quiet poverty, than to receive a salary to lie. When the Prince-Elector read this letter in his luxurious court in Heidelberg, he remained silent for a long time. Then he passed the letter to an advisor and said in German, "Dieser Mann ist gefährlicher, als ich dachte. Aber ist auch größer als alles, was ich bisher gesehen habe. This man is more dangerous than I thought, but he is also greater than anything I have seen so far." In May 1671, Spinoza made his last major move. He left Voorburg and moved permanently to The Hague. He rented a room in the house of a widow named van der Werve on Stille Weerkade, a quiet street near the Central Canal. It was a small room, but what he valued most was the window. A tall window facing west, through which the afternoon light entered with a golden softness. For a man who polished lenses to survive and wrote philosophy for posterity, light was everything. It was in this room that Spinoza would live the last 5 years of his life, and it was in this room that he finally finished the work that consumed him for 15 years. The Ethics. The Ethics was not a book like the others. It was written in the style of Euclid's Elements, the Greek mathematical treatise that had been the most influential book in geometry for 2,000 years. Spinoza adopted the same method: definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries. Each statement was followed by its rigorous proof. Each conclusion was deduced from previously established premises. It was philosophy written like mathematics, and the content was even more radical than the form. The work began with a definition that destroyed all traditional theology in a single sentence. By substance, I understand that which is in itself and is conceived by itself. This seemingly abstract definition hid a bomb, for Spinoza then demonstrated that only one such substance could exist, and that this unique substance was what men called God, and that this unique substance was also what men called nature, and that therefore God and nature were two words for the same reality. Deus sive natura. Whoever read this first part and understood what it truly said was left dizzy. For Spinoza was demonstrating with mathematical rigor that everything that exists is a single infinite reality, that there is no creator separate from creation, that there is no personal God above the world, that the entire universe, including the stars, the stones, the plants, the animals, humans, and even the innermost thoughts of the human soul, is a single substance expressing itself in infinite modes. But the Ethics could not be published in his lifetime. When Spinoza tried to deliver it to the printer in 1675, the news leaked. The Calvinist pastors mobilized. The civil authorities alerted the printer. Within a few weeks, it became clear that publishing the work at that moment would mean the immediate imprisonment of the author and the destruction of the book before it could even circulate. Spinoza retrieved the manuscript. He took it back home. He stored it in a small, dark wooden box under the bed, and he told his friends with the serenity that always accompanied him, "It doesn't matter. It will wait. The time of books is different from the time of men. If I die before it comes out, you will publish it for me." The friends promised. And they kept their promise. Death came for Baruch Spinoza on Sunday, February 21, 1677. He was 44 years old. Tuberculosis, exacerbated by more than 20 years inhaling fine glass dust during polishing work, had finally defeated his slender body. For months he had been coughing more, eating less. His hands trembled slightly when he held the pen. His face, always thin, now had the sunken cheeks of someone nearing the end. But he never complained, never asked for special medical help, never spoke of his health to his friends. He continued polishing lenses in the morning, reading in the afternoon, writing at night, living with the simplicity he always had: bread, cheese, water with a few drops of wine. On a night in January of that year, after a coughing fit stronger than usual, he called his friend Lodewijk Meyer to his room. "Lodewijk," he said with a voice weaker than usual, "I know what is happening. I don't need you to lie to me. I have perhaps a few weeks, maybe less. I want to leave everything organized." Meyer tried to protest. He said there were still treatments, that they could call other doctors, but Spinoza simply smiled, that gentle smile that always disarmed any interlocutor, and made a gesture with his hand. "No, it is time. I have lived what I had to live. I have written what I had to write. The rest no longer belongs to me." That night, he dictated to Meyer his last instructions. He asked that after his death, his manuscripts be sent to Jan Ruwerts, the printer friend in Amsterdam. He asked that the ethics be published anonymously, without dedication, without a laudatory preface, just with the text. He asked that his few material belongings be distributed among close friends. He asked that his body be buried in a simple grave, without religious ceremony, without sermon, without elaborate epitaph. "And you," Meyer asked with tears in his eyes, "what do you want to be said about you afterwards?" Spinoza thought for a moment. Then he replied with that serenity that was his hallmark, "Just say this, that I lived as I could, and that I thought as I should. Nothing more." And finally, that Sunday of February 21st arrived. It was a cold afternoon. The sun entered obliquely through the bedroom window, gilding the wooden floor. Meyer was by his side. The landlady was downstairs, preparing a soup that Spinoza would never eat. The other family members had gone to church for the Sunday morning service. Spinoza was sitting in an armchair near the window. He had an open book on his lap, not his own ethics, not the theological political treatise, but a worn copy of Euclid's Elements, marked in the margins with annotations from many years ago. The book that had inspired the form of all his philosophy, the book of pure geometry, the book of eternal demonstrations. Spinoza coughed once. He lifted his eyes. He looked out the window at the afternoon light, at the rooftops of The Hague in the distance. He smiled slightly and said in a low voice, in Latin, "Vivi, cogitavi, sufficit." I lived, I thought. It is enough. Then he closed his eyes. The cough came again, stronger. His body bent. The right hand, which had written the ethics, slid across the open page of Euclid and remained still over the geometric propositions. And at that moment, Baruch de Spinoza, the excommunicated lens grinder, the pursued philosopher, the man who had challenged 3 centuries of theology, the thinker who had rediscovered with the rigor of a mathematician humanity's oldest truth about its own origin, became definitively part of the infinite substance he had written about throughout his life. He was 44 years old. Meyer stared at him for a long time, in silence, without moving. Then, slowly, he closed his eyes. He took the papers that were on the nearby table and carefully stored them in a wooden box. He also took the complete ethics from the box under the bed. And finally, and this few historians know, he went to the floor of the room. He removed 2 loose boards in the corner near the window, and found there, hidden for more than 15 years, the small wooden chest that Spinoza had never shown to anyone. Inside the chest were 3 things: Spinoza's secret notebook, with his notes on the origin of man; the notebook of the wise Sephardic man from Aleppo, with translations of Sumerian cuneiform, and, carefully wrapped in blue cloth, the 5,000-year-old tablet that a hooded stranger had handed to the philosopher on a February night in 1662 in Rheinsberg, amidst a snowstorm. Maya was paralyzed when he saw the tablet. He did not know of its existence. Spinoza had never spoken of it aloud, not even to his closest friends. It was a secret kept within an even deeper layer of silence. "Mio Dio," he whispered, holding the tablet with trembling hands. But he was a man of action, and he knew what to do. That very night, along with Baruch Spinoza, another close friend, Maya placed everything in a heavy oak box, sealed it with hot wax, and handed it to a trusted porter who left before dawn for Amsterdam. The box crossed Holland in silence, carried by discreet hands hidden under hay and sacks of oats, until it reached the workshop of the printer, Jan Rieverts. And it was there, in that damp basement where forbidden books were printed under false names, that Baruch Spinoza's legacy began its second life, a life that would last for centuries, a life that he himself would never see. The Ethics was published in December 1677, 10 months after the author's death. It was released without Spinoza's name on the cover. Only the initials BDS appeared discreetly at the beginning of the volume. The first 1,000 copies were secretly distributed across Europe, hidden among innocent books, medical treatises, gardening manuals, almanacs. Within weeks, copies reached Paris, London, Berlin, Rome, Vienna, Stockholm. And the effect was immediate. The theologians panicked. The Vatican placed the work on the list of prohibited books, where it would remain for over 200 years. German Lutherans burned copies in public squares. Dutch Calvinists denounced it in Sunday sermons. But as always happens with truly important books, the prohibition had the opposite effect of what was expected. The Ethics became a cult book. It was passed from hand to hand. It was copied by hand in clandestine manuscripts. And it began slowly to shape the minds of an entire generation of thinkers who would change the course of Western history. As for the tablet and the notebook of the wise man from Aleppo, Rieverts, not knowing exactly what to do with those mysterious objects, carefully wrapped them and placed them at the bottom of a special chest marked only with the initials BDS. This chest was kept in his basement for decades. Then it passed to his son, then to his grandson, then to a family of merchants who inherited the old workshop. And, in the early 19th century, it ended up in the archives of the Royal Library of The Hague, catalogued simply as Various Documents BDS, forgotten on the deepest shelves for over 100 years. Until, on February 21, 1976, exactly 300 years after Spinoza's death, a young Dutch researcher named Peter Steenbergen, working as an intern at the Royal Library, would open the chest, find the tablet, and understand with tears in his eyes that he was touching, with white gloves, a piece of clay that had been touched by Spinoza himself more than 3 centuries earlier. But that, my friend, is a story yet to be told. The news of Spinoza's death took time to spread. His close friends wanted it that way. They knew that if the news reached the wrong ears too quickly, the house where he had died could be invaded and the manuscripts confiscated. Therefore, for 3 days, they kept everything in absolute silence. Only Lodewijk Meyer, Baruch Spinoza, and the landlady knew what had happened in that room on Stille Veerkade. And it was during those 3 days of silence that the fate of the manuscripts was decided. The Ethics went to Amsterdam inside a sealed oak box. The secret notebook went along. The notebook of the wise man from Aleppo went along. And the Sumerian tablet, wrapped in blue cloth, went along too, but with a crucial difference. Rieverts, upon receiving it, did not know exactly what it was. He only recognized that it was something precious, ancient, and potentially dangerous. He decided, out of prudence, to separate it from the other documents and keep it in a locked chest, marked only with the initials BDS. This small gesture, this simple act of protection, would save the tablet for posterity, for, had it remained with Spinoza's papers, it would have been seen by the editors. It would have caused a scandal. It would have been confiscated by the religious authorities, who were already keeping an eye on everything that belonged to the deceased philosopher. And it would have almost certainly been destroyed as a suspect pagan object, a fate that so many other ancient artifacts suffered at that time. But Rieverts kept it, and, by keeping it, He created the conditions for it to pass through the next 3 centuries forgotten, safely, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The Ethics was published in December 1677. The European reaction was immediate and brutal. In less than 6 months, the book was banned in the Netherlands, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and the Papal States. The Vatican placed it on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1679, where it would officially remain for 250 years. Calvinist pastors preached against it every Sunday. Jesuit priests wrote dozens of treatises refuting it. European rabbis warned their communities not to touch it. And yet, it spread. Clandestine copies circulated in Paris, hidden inside medical treatises. Copies reached London on Dutch merchant ships. Copies crossed the Alps in the backpacks of merchants going to Rome and Florence. Within a few decades, every serious European intellectual had read the Ethics, or at least pretended to have read it, so as not to appear ignorant. And then began the long underground process by which Spinoza's ideas slowly infiltrated the brightest minds of each new generation. Immanuel Kant, in Königsberg, read the Ethics several times in secret, at night, in his small study. Although he officially disagreed with Spinoza, he wrote in a private letter, only discovered after his death, "I cannot accept Spinoza entirely, but I also cannot refute him entirely. There is something in his philosophy that haunts me like a shadow." Hegel at the University of Berlin told his students, "Whoever wants to be a philosopher must first have been a Spinozist. There is no other entry into philosophy." Goethe, the greatest poet of German literature, carried the Ethics with him for years. He read it before sleeping and claimed that it had been the book that most pacified him in moments of inner storm. Schelling, the young romantic, wrote poems in honor of Spinoza and said he had found in him the breath of God in the form of geometry. And, more than 200 years after the philosopher's death, a man born in Ulm, Germany, in 1879, a man who would change physics, cosmology, and human understanding of time, space, and matter, would one day receive a question that would cause Spinoza's name to finally return to the world's newspapers. That man was named Albert Einstein, and what he would answer would change everything. In 1929, a rabbi from New York sent an urgent telegram to Albert Einstein. The scientist was 50 years old. He was a professor in Berlin. He was already world famous for the theory of relativity, and the rabbi's telegram contained only 5 words. "Do you believe in God? I will pay $50 for the answer." Einstein, known for his dry humor, sat at the table, took a sheet of paper, and wrote a response that would become one of the most famous phrases of the 20th century. "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of all that exists. I do not believe in a God who concerns himself with the fate and actions of human beings." When this response was published the next day in all the newspapers of the world, it generated a wave of astonishment. Who was this Spinoza, after all? Why did the greatest living scientist on the planet choose precisely the name of an obscure 17th century Dutch philosopher to define his own faith? The question caused thousands of people around the world to seek the Ethics in libraries. Within weeks, new editions of the book began to be published in various languages. Spinoza, more than 2.5 centuries after his death, was read, discussed, and translated again. And the truth he had tried to reveal, about the unity between man and the universe, about the natural origin of consciousness, about the fallacy of miraculous creation, began finally to be heard on a global scale. But Einstein was not the only scientist of the 20th century rediscovering Spinoza. There were many others. In 1859, exactly 2 centuries after the clandestine publication of the theological political treatise, an English naturalist of 50 published a book that forever changed human understanding of its own origin. The man's name was Charles Darwin. The book was called On the Origin of Species. Darwin had spent 20 years studying the processes by which living species arise and transform, and he had concluded that species were not created separately by a god. They emerged from one another over millions of years through natural selection. And man, that vain animal who considered himself the center of creation, was just another branch of that immense tree of natural descent. In 1871, Darwin published The Descent of Man, where he finally drew the inevitable conclusion. Man descended from earlier forms. He was not a special creation. He was a product of nature, like everything else. The reaction was violent. Bishops denounced him. Caricatures portrayed him as a monkey. But within a few decades, the theory of evolution became scientific consensus, and what few people realized at that moment was that Darwin was confirming, with empirical data, exactly what Spinoza had intuited 200 years earlier. Spinoza had said, with pure reason, that man emerged from nature itself. Darwin was now demonstrating, with fossils and observations, how that emergence had occurred. The philosophical intuition of the lens grinder was gaining its scientific confirmation. And, in 1845, in parallel, something extraordinary began to happen in Iraq. British archaeologists, led by Austin Henry Layard, began to excavate the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh. The excavations revealed an entire library of clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing, thousands of them buried for more than 2,500 years beneath the ruins of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's palace. No one knew how to read that writing. It had been lost for over 20 centuries. But over the following decades, a massive effort to decipher it began. And in 1872, a modest employee of the British Museum named George Smith made a discovery that shook the world. Reading a newly deciphered tablet, Smith found a narrative of a universal flood, centuries older than Noah's narrative in Genesis, and containing practically the same elements: ark, saved animals, dove sent to look for land, mountain where the vessel ran aground. Smith was so impressed that, according to witnesses, he stood up from the table, began to take off his clothes, and ran around the room in a state of excitement. His colleagues had to hold him down. The discovery proved, for the first time with physical evidence, that the stories of Genesis were not original. They were rewritten versions of much older myths from the Mesopotamian tradition. And with that, 2 centuries after Spinoza's death, what he had intuited while secretly reading the notebook of the wise man from Aleppo was finally beginning to be confirmed archaeologically. On February 21, 1976, exactly 300 years after Spinoza's death, a young Dutch researcher named Peter Steenbergen was working as an intern at the Royal Library of The Hague. It was a cold winter. The archives seemed to him a monotonous job. But on that specific day, Peter found something that would change his life. He was cataloguing a little visited section when his eyes fell on an old chest, forgotten among dusty shelves. The chest was marked with faded letters, BDS. Peter felt a shiver. He knew perfectly well what those initials meant. He asked his supervisor for permission to open the chest. He received permission distractedly. And that cold afternoon, with white gloves and an involuntary reverence, he opened a chest that had been sealed for over 200 years. Inside, he found several unpublished letters from Spinoza in Latin and Dutch, a battered black notebook with personal notes, pages marked by moths with fragments of an unfinished work on politics, and at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in very old blue cloth, a small, heavy object. Peter unwrapped the object with trembling hands, and when the cloth opened on the examination table, he saw, in the fluorescent light of the laboratory, a cuneiform clay tablet, broken at the corners, stained by time, but with inscriptions still perfectly legible. Peter knew how to read cuneiform. He had specialized in Assyriology. And as his eyes passed over the ancient symbols, he felt the world slowly spin around him. The tablet narrated, in archaic Sumerian, the origin of man. Not as creation, but as emergence. Not as shaping clay by the hands of a god, but as the slow result of an immense cosmic process. The symbols told that before man, there were intermediate forms. That, before those forms, there was the unique substance, and that this substance, even today, sleeps within every existing thing. It was the same tablet that Spinoza had touched in Rheinsberg, more than 3 centuries earlier. Peter sat on the floor of the archive. He cried he could not work for the rest of the day, and the next morning he wrote a letter to the International Spinoza Studies Committee, announcing the discovery. The news exploded in academic circles around the world. The tablet was dated by specialists to around 500 years before Christ. Its authenticity was confirmed by scientific examinations. And its translation, made over the following years by an international team, revealed extraordinary contents, exactly the same as those transcribed in the notebook of the wise man from Aleppo, found inside the same chest. And at the same time, in other excavations around the world, researchers began to find similar tablets, in Eridu, in Lagash, in Uruk, in Mari. In all, the same pattern repeated. Man was not seen as a creature shaped by a single god, but as a product of complex cosmic processes, involving the interaction between matter, energy, and something that the ancients called dormant substance, or primordial consciousness. The archaeologists realized with astonishment that they were dealing with an entire corpus of ancient thought that had been systematically erased by later religious tradition. In 1980, 3 years after Peter's discovery, an international symposium was held in The Hague, in the very city where Spinoza had died. The theme was Spinoza and the origins of cosmic consciousness. And it was at this symposium that David Bohm, a disciple of Einstein and one of the fathers of modern quantum physics, presented a lecture that shook all those present. Bohm explained that modern physics was arriving, through completely different paths, at the same conclusions that Spinoza had formulated 3 centuries earlier. Quantum physicists discovered that matter, at its deepest level, is not composed of isolated particles, but of a continuous energy field that connects everything that exists, that the observer and the observed cannot be completely separated, and that, ultimately, everything that exists seems to be part of a single web of relationships, exactly what Spinoza called unique substance. Bohm ended his lecture with a phrase that would be etched in the memory of all those present. Spinoza was not just philosophizing. He was describing, with the limited instruments of his time, exactly the physical reality that we, 3 centuries later, are finally managing to measure with our instruments. But there is a detail in this story that has not yet been mentioned, and it is perhaps the most disturbing of all. For while humanity discovered over the centuries the truth about its natural origin, it also discovered something more. Something that Spinoza had only begun to glimpse in his last notebooks. The idea is this: if man is, as Spinoza demonstrated, an expression of the infinite substance that becomes conscious of itself, then every human being that exists carries within themselves the totality of the universe. Not as a metaphor, not as poetry, but as a literal fact. Each person is the universe opening its eyes. Each thought is the cosmos thinking of itself. Each feeling is the infinite substance feeling, through one of its finite forms. This idea completely transforms the way we see human existence. For if it is true, then each human being is not an isolated individual, but a point of contact between the finite and the infinite, a portal through which the universe experiences itself, and, more importantly, it means that what we call death is not the end. It is merely the passage from one mode to another mode of the same substance. When you die, Spinoza wrote in one of his last notes, you will not disappear. You will simply return to the form you have always been in, before taking this specific form. There is nothing to fear. There is nothing to lose. What you are, at the most fundamental level, is eternal by nature. This idea, deeply comforting, is also profoundly revolutionary, for it removes from man the fear of death, and a man who is not afraid of death is, according to all ancient thinkers, a truly free man. Free from governments that threaten him with violence, free from religions that threaten him with hell, free from ideologies that threaten him with destruction. Perhaps that is why the religious and political powers of Spinoza's time tried so desperately to silence him, not because his thought was too complicated for the people. On the contrary, because it was too simple, because it was too liberating, because, if the people truly understood what that lens grinder was saying, the entire structure of fear and control that sustained society would crumble. But thought, as Spinoza knew, is like light. It can be blocked for a time. It can be obscured by thick clouds. But in the end, it always finds a crack to pass through, and once it passes, it illuminates everything it touches. That is exactly what happened over the centuries with Spinoza's ideas. The theologians prohibited them, the kings condemned them, the popes blacklisted them. But they continued to pass crack by crack, mind by mind, generation after generation, until they reached you, reader, at this moment. And now that they have reached you, something in you recognizes what is being said. Not as new information, but as ancient remembrance, as if you, deep down, always knew. As if this truth had, all along, been hidden in some corner of your ancestral memory, waiting for the right moment to awaken. There is a final phrase in Spinoza's secret notebook, found in the chest in The Hague. A phrase he wrote a few months before he died, a kind of intellectual testament. When man finally understands that he was not created from the outside, but that he emerged from within the very infinite substance, he will discover something that changes everything, that he is not alone, that he has never been alone, that in every atom of his body, in every thought of his mind, in every beat of his heart, is the entire history of the universe, condensed and active. And he will also discover that true happiness does not consist in seeking anything outside of himself, but in recognizing what is already within him, by the simple fact of existing. When this phrase was translated and published in 1985, several readers wrote letters to the Library of The Hague, saying that upon reading it, they had cried without knowing why. Others said they felt a strange warmth in their chest. Still others said that after that phrase, their lives had changed in ways they could not explain. The phrase has this power because it touches on something true, something that was in Spinoza, something that was before him in the Sumerian tablets, something that is in us now at this very moment. Modern science, without even mentioning Spinoza, has been confirming his intuitions one after another. In 2003, geneticists announced the complete mapping of the human genome. For the first time in history, we knew in molecular detail what we are. More than 3 billion base pairs, about 20,000 genes. And, within this genome, genetic fragments coming from other species, viral genes integrated millions of years ago, sequences shared with bacteria, plants, extinct mammals. Every human being carries in their cells genetic fragments of practically the entire history of life on Earth. In 2010, neuroscientists at the University of Wisconsin proposed the theory of integrated information, according to which consciousness is not exclusive to the human brain, but a physical property that appears whenever there are sufficiently integrated information systems. In other words, consciousness exists in different degrees in many systems, in mammals, in birds, in octopuses, perhaps even in simpler forms. When this theory was published, several philosophers immediately noticed the parallel with Spinoza. 350 years earlier, he had written in his secret notebook, "Everything thinks," to some degree. In 2012, physicists at CERN in Switzerland announced the discovery of the Higgs boson, the fundamental particle that gives mass to other particles. This discovery confirmed the standard model of physics, according to which the universe, at its deepest level, is not composed of separate things, but of continuous fields, of which particles are merely point-like excitations. The universe is a unified web that expresses itself in finite modes. Spinoza had said exactly that in Latin 3.5 centuries earlier. But scientific discoveries, no matter how spectacular, do not answer the most important question. What does all this mean for you? Science can map DNA. It can measure brainwaves. It can describe the universe in equations. But it cannot tell us on its own how we should live, how we should love, how we should die. And that is where Spinoza, 3 centuries later, still has something to offer that science cannot provide. For he did not only write about the structure of the universe, he wrote, above all, about how to live well. He said, "Free yourself from sad passions. Do not live as a slave to fear, anger, envy." These emotions do not come from reality. They come from the confused way you perceive reality. The clearer your understanding, the lighter your life will be. He said, "Do not seek happiness in external things. External things are impermanent. True happiness lies in knowing yourself, in understanding your relationship with the whole, in feeling day after day the subtle joy of existing as part of the infinite substance. He said, "Love others not because an external God commands it, but because you recognize, in each other, human being, an expression of the same substance that expresses itself in you. You love the other as you love yourself, because the other is, in some deep sense, yourself, in another form." He said, "Face death with tranquility. There is nothing to fear. You will not disappear. You will simply return to being in another form what you have always been, and while you are alive, live intensely, not with agitation, but with full presence. Every moment you experience is the universe experiencing itself through you." These ideas, 3 centuries later, continue to speak to us, perhaps even more now than at that time, for we live in a time when many people feel lost, anxious, separated, desperate. A time when traditional religions have lost strength for many, but where there is still a deep search for some kind of meaning. Spinoza offers a bridge between science and the soul, between rational knowledge and inner peace, between understanding and feeling, and those who cross this bridge, even for moments, discover something that changes everything. They discover that they are not alone, that they have never been alone, that their existence, no matter how small it seems, is part of something immense, that their thought, no matter how limited, is an expression of cosmic intelligence, that their love, no matter how fragile, is a spark of the infinite love that moves everything that exists. And they discover that the story of clay was just that, a story. Beautiful in its poetic simplicity, useful in its attempt to give meaning, but too small to contain the real truth. The real truth is that you were never made. You have always been here in some way, and you will always be in some way, even after this specific form that you are now dissolves. There is a moment in each person's life when we perceive something that can no longer be unseen. It can come in many forms. It can come by looking at the sea at sunset and suddenly feeling that we are made of the same water. It can come by looking into the eyes of someone we love and realizing that that person is not separate from us, but is part of the same fabric. It can come by walking in the silence of a forest and feeling, without words, that every leaf, every stone, every breath of the wind is part of the same breath that we are. It can come by reading an ancient book at night and suddenly feeling that those words written centuries ago were written just for us. That moment, when it arrives, is what Spinoza tried to describe in his philosophy. It is the moment when the illusion of separation breaks, and we realize with a clarity that no rational argument can produce alone, that we are part of something infinite. Mystics call this enlightenment. Philosophers call it the intuition of unity. Poets call it cosmic love. Physicists call it integrated consciousness. The ancient Sumerians called it the remembrance of the sleeping substance. Each culture has its name, but the experience, at its core, is the same. And when this experience arrives, no matter how brief, it changes something within us that does not return to how it was before. Spinoza lived his entire life trying to bring this experience within the reach of reason, trying to demonstrate with geometric propositions what is normally only felt in mystical moments, trying to build a bridge between rational knowledge and contemplative wisdom. And he succeeded, at least in part. The Ethics today, 3.5 centuries after it was written, continues to be read in all the languages of the world. It continues to be studied in universities. It continues to touch readers who had never heard of philosophy, but who open the book out of curiosity and find themselves 3 hours later with tears in their eyes without knowing why. The effects of Spinoza's thought are everywhere, even where no one cites him. They are in the modern idea of religious tolerance, which he advocated before almost anyone else. They are in the idea that science and religion can dialogue, which he practiced in all his books. They are in the idea that man is part of nature and not its owner, which has become the foundation of the contemporary environmental movement. They are in the idea that happiness comes from knowledge and not from consumption, which is being rediscovered now in times of excess and anxiety. And they are, above all, in that deep intuition that many people are beginning to have in different cultures at different ages, without knowing how to explain where it comes from. The intuition that we are one, that everything is connected, that the separation between me and the other, between man and nature, between the material and the spiritual, is an illusion. Let us return for a moment to the question that opened this story, back at the beginning. Where do we really come from? Do you remember? It was the question that had pursued humanity for millennia, the question answered by religions with the story of clay, by science with the theory of evolution, by Spinoza with the theory of infinite substance. And what is, after all, the answer? Perhaps none of these answers alone is complete. Perhaps the answer is the integration of all of them. Science tells us how we emerged through billions of years of cosmic and biological evolution. Religions give us symbols to signify this origin. Spinoza gives us the philosophical framework to integrate all this, showing that we are finite modes of an infinite substance. But perhaps the deepest answer does not lie in any of these explanations. Perhaps it lies in direct experience, in moments when you simply feel, without needing to think, that you are part of something immense, in moments of silence, contemplation, love, wonder. These experiences, according to Spinoza, are not illusions. They are the deepest knowledge a human being can have. They are what he called, in the fifth part of the Ethics, the third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge, direct, that goes beyond words and arguments. And when you have this kind of knowledge, no matter how rare it is, you touch the same truth that the ancient Sumerians had inscribed on their tablets, the same truth that Spinoza had demonstrated in geometric propositions, the same truth that Einstein had glimpsed in his equations, the truth that we are part, the truth that we have never been separate, the truth that the infinite substance pulses in each of us, and that each of us is, in some fundamental sense, it itself, manifesting in a temporary but real form. And you, reader, who have come this far, you are part of this chain, part of this invisible current that goes from the ancient Sumerians through Spinoza, through Einstein, through philosophers and scientists, until it reaches this exact moment when your eyes run over these final words. You did not arrive here by chance. Those who reach the end of a journey like this do so because they are ready to arrive. It is because, at some level, they already felt something of what has been said. They already knew, even without knowing. And now that these words have reached you, they will not leave you. They will stay inside you, in some quiet place. And, at some future moment, they will return to the surface at the moment when you need them most. They will return when you are afraid, and they will remind you that you are part of something eternal. They will return when you are suffering, and they will remind you that this suffering, although real, is not the whole of existence. They will return when you are joyful, and they will expand that joy to cosmic proportions, for that is what true philosophy does. It is not about memorizing concepts, it is not about quoting authors, it is about planting seeds of understanding within the reader and trusting that these seeds will germinate in their own time. The sacred story, as we said at the beginning, may have concealed the true origin of man, but the silence finally is over. Today we know, and knowing, according to Spinoza, is the beginning of freedom. And freedom is the beginning of true happiness. And true happiness, in the end, is just that, the simple and profound recognition that we are exactly where we need to be, being exactly what we need to be, in every moment of this brief but eternal journey we call life. On that night in February 1677, when Baruch Spinoza closed his eyes for the last time, with a geometry book on his knees and the golden light of the afternoon falling on his face, he whispered in Latin his last three words, Vivi, cogitavi, sufficit. I lived, I thought, it is enough. May each of us, at the end of our own journeys, be able to say the same, with the same serenity, with the same certainty, with the same silent smile of someone who discovered before departing what truly matters. For what truly matters in the end is not how much we lived. It is how much during this life we managed to awaken. And remember, if only for moments, that we were never dust, that we were never clay, that we have always been and always will be part of the same infinite light that illuminates, at this very moment, every atom of the known universe. The sacred story may have hidden it, But the truth, patient as always, waited. And now, finally, it is here, in you.